Master of 10 languages, I faked being an incompetent translator for 3 years. After returning to the States, I landed a job at a top-tier multinational corporation, Apex International. But I deliberately flew under the radar, pretending to be a useless translator who could barely scrape by on basic English. My coworkers mocked me. How did someone with her skills even get hired? She must have serious connections. My manager humiliated me in front of everyone. You can't even handle a basic niche language. What good are you to this company? I kept my head down, playing the fool, until the company's biggest multinational deal fell through. A 10-nation delegation revolted in unison, leaving the CEO completely overwhelmed and sweating bullets in the boardroom. I pushed open the boardroom doors and calmed them down, addressing each delegation in their own native tongue. As I seamlessly transitioned between 10 different languages, the entire room fell dead silent. 01. My name is Vivian Vance. 8 years of studying abroad, dual PhDs, fluent in 10 languages. None of this was on public record. After moving back to the States, I joined the country's most prestigious multinational conglomerate, Apex International. My position was an entry-level translator in the localization department. I intentionally hid my sharpness. On my resume, I only wrote English proficiency, basic. During the interview, I purposefully faked a stutter and acted hesitant. When I finally got the job, everyone assumed I was just a nepotism hire. The charity case, that was the first label my coworker, Cece, slapped on me. Today marked my 3rd month at the company. Cece sauntered past my cubicle, holding a fresh cup of coffee. Her wrist took a sudden, accidental tilt. The scalding black coffee poured entirely over my printed dossiers. "Oh my God, I am so sorry." She cried out in an exaggerated gasp, though her tone carried absolutely no remorse. The surrounding coworkers turned to look. Their eyes flashed with unhidden, malicious amusement. I didn't say a word. I just quietly picked up a few paper towels and began dabbing the soaked documents. That was a crucial translation draft scheduled to be submitted to our manager in an hour. Now a massive, unsightly brown stain bled across the pages. Cece stood over me, looking down her nose. "Vivian, do you not have eyes when you sit there?" Clearly, she was the one who ran into me. I lifted my head and looked at her calmly. "I'm sorry," I murmured. Cece smirked, as if she had just heard the funniest joke in the world. "Trash is trash. You can't even apologize with a spine." She crossed her arms, her voice raised just enough so the entire open office could hear every word. How does someone with this pathetic level of skill even crawl into Apex? I seriously wonder whose backroom she had to slip through. Right? Last week, she even botched a couple of basic lines in a standard English email, another coworker chimed in. If Manager Miller weren't so soft-hearted, she would have been kicked to the curb weeks ago. The whispers pricked at me like needles from every direction. I remained silent. I used the paper towels to absorb the moisture from the paper bit by bit, then began slowly copying the ruined sections by hand. I wrote deliberately slowly, looking clumsy, just like the persona I had built. Seeing that I wasn't biting the bait, Cece lost interest. She let out a cold scoff, turned on her heels, and swayed away. I watched her retreating back, my gaze turning ice-cold for a fraction of a second. I was waiting for the perfect window. A moment that would force every single person who looked down on me to shut their mouths permanently. Manager Marcus Miller stepped out of his corner office. He was the head of my specific translation unit, a man in his late alignment of 40, wearing gold-rimmed glasses, looking refined, scholarly, and entirely sophisticated. He noticed the absolute mess on my desk. His brows furrowed instantly. "Vivian, what is the meaning of this?" "Manager Miller, I accidentally spilled my coffee," I answered before anyone else could speak. Miller's gaze dropped to the stained document, his disgust entirely undisguised. "You can't even keep a single file safe. What good are you to this department? Redo the entire thing and have a clean copy on my desk before you clock out." He dropped those words coldly, turned around, and walked away. He didn't bother to ask if I had been burned by the scalding liquid. Nor did he care that it was already 4 p.m. There were only 2 hours left before the end of the workday. I looked down at the manuscript, which required retranslating over 20 complex pages. Taking a deep breath, I threw the entire stack straight into the trash can. I booted up my computer, pulled up my secure cloud backup, reformatted the text, and hit print. The entire process took less than 5 minutes. Holding the pristine, freshly printed document, I knocked on Manager Miller's door. He looked up, visibly startled to see me. "You redid it already?" "Yes, manager." He took the file, flipped through it absent-mindedly, and tossed it onto his mahogany desk. "Fine. Get out." I turned around and closed the door behind me. Through the frosted glass, I watched him pick up the document I had just handed him and feed it directly into his heavy-duty paper shredder. My heart went cold along with the shredding paper. I am keeping score. 0-2. The next day, the atmosphere in the office was suffocatingly tense. Word had traveled that the company was bidding for a gargantuan, multi-billion-dollar transnational project. The client was a massive coalition composed of delegations from 10 different countries, colloquially known as the 10-Nation Alliance. If Apex International could lock this down, our global market standing would skyrocket to an unprecedented level. Because of this, every department in the company was wound tighter than a guitar string. The localization and translation department, naturally, was on the front line of the fire. Manager Miller called a mandatory all-hands meeting for our unit. "This Project Starlight is paramount to the firm's survival," Miller began, his eyes scanning the room. "Our team is fully responsible for the initial translation of all foundational dossiers. The materials span 10 different national languages. The difficulty is astronomical, and the deadline is razor-thin." His gaze landed on his favorite employee. "Cece, you're handling the French and German portfolios. You're our ace. You absolutely cannot drop the ball on this." Cece lifted her chin with an arrogant smirk. "Consider it done, manager." Miller proceeded to allocate Spanish, Russian, Japanese, Italian. Every seasoned translator in the room received a language corresponding to their expertise. Finally, only I was left. Every eye in the boardroom locked onto me. Miller picked up the final, thinnest folder and tossed it across the table, sliding it until it stopped right in front of me. It was a document in Portuguese. "Vivian, you take the Portuguese portfolio. It's the simplest, with the fewest pages. It should suit your speed," he said dismissively. Cece let out a sharp sneer from across the table. "Manager, you seriously have the nerve to trust her with that? She can barely string a coherent sentence together in English, and you think she knows Portuguese." Miller adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses, a streak of raw contempt flashing behind the lenses. "We have to give her something to do, otherwise the executives will think our department is running a charity for the incompetent. If she botches even this, she can pack her bags and walk out." A blatant, naked humiliation. The entire meeting room held its breath, waiting to enjoy the spectacle of my failure. I maintained my submissive, downcast expression. "Understood, manager." I picked up the thin folder and returned to my cubicle. The document was indeed short, only 3 pages. However, the contents were entirely comprised of incredibly dense, hyper-specialized legal clauses and precise engineering parameters. Cece clicked over in her high heels, leaning casually against the edge of my desk. "Hey, charity case. Want Big Sister to look it over for you? I actually minored in Portuguese back in college." Her voice dripped with condescension and performative charity. "But just so you know, my consulting fees are steep. $1,000 a word. Can you even afford that?" I ignored her, opened my browser, and began using a basic search engine to look up words. My movements were intentionally slow. I typed out each letter on the keyboard one by one. I was using the most primitive, free online translation tool available to the public. Cece watched my screen and burst into a fit of hysterical laughter. "Oh my God, you're actually using that trash? The sentences generated by that software are pure garbage. Can a human even read that?" "Whatever, I'm wasting my breath. Don't come crying to me when the manager tears you to shreds later." She laughed all the way back to her desk. I looked at the absolute gibberish displayed on the monitor, my face entirely expressionless. My actual laptop contained a proprietary translation architecture that I had coded myself, a system integrated with the world's most elite linguistic databases and custom AI algorithms. Its precision surpassed any commercial software on the market by a century. But I couldn't use it. At least, not yet. I copied the machine-translated text into a Word document and began altering it word by word. I intentionally introduced several structural errors. I translated critical industry terms using the most amateurish, literal interpretations possible. At 3 p.m., Manager Miller demanded I hand in the completed file. He took one glance at the first page and slammed the papers violently against my face. The sharp edge of the paper sliced across my cheek, leaving a faint, stinging red line. "Vivian, what the hell is this garbage?" His voice erupted in a thunderous roar that echoed across the entire floor. "You translated floating exchange rate as drifting prices? And intellectual property barriers became clever walls? Are you a total idiot? Or do you take me for one?" He pointed a finger directly at my nose, his face contorted with rage. "I knew it from day one, a piece of useless trash like you has no business being at Apex. Get out of my sight. Pack your things and get the hell out of this building right now." I stood entirely still in front of his desk. My head was bowed, my long hair falling forward to completely obscure my expression. The office fell into a dead, absolute silence. Everyone was waiting for me to burst into tears, or waiting for me to run away in shame. The corners of Cece's mouth twitched with a triumphant smirk she could barely suppress. Slowly, I lifted my head. I looked straight into Miller's rage-twisted face. "Manager," I said. My voice was quiet, but exceptionally clear. "Are you absolutely certain you want me to pack my bags right now? If this multi-billion-dollar project implodes because you kicked out a piece of trash, can your career survive that kind of fallout?" Miller froze. He hadn't anticipated that the girl who had spent 3 months being a submissive doormat would suddenly bite back. Worse, my words carried an icy, implicit threat. He let out a sharp, angry laugh. "My career? You think a useless nobody like you affects my career? What a joke. I am firing you right now. Let's see if this company stops spinning without a charity case." He grabbed his desk phone, ready to dial HR. Before his fingers could hit the keys, his personal cell phone rang frantically. It was the dedicated internal line from the CEO's office. Miller's expression shifted instantly. He scrambled to press the accept button. The voice of the CEO's executive assistant blasted through the receiver, so panicked it was entirely out of pitch. "Manager Miller, Project Starlight is imploding in the boardroom. The 10-nation delegation is revolting over massive translation discrepancies in the core contract. The CEO orders you to bring every single niche language translator up to the penthouse boardroom right now. Move." Miller's face turned completely, utterly pale. 03. Manager Miller hung up the phone. His hand was visibly trembling. He stared at me, his eyes a messy cocktail of shock, fury, and a mounting, trapped panic. "What are you all staring at? Get back to work," he barked at the stunned staff members watching from their desks. Then he aggressively straightened his silk tie and turned sharply to Cece. "Cece, Smith, Davis, grab your laptops. Follow me to the penthouse floor right now." The individuals called out were the certified linguistic elites of our unit. Their faces instantly flushed with a smug sense of self-importance at being summoned to save the day. As Cece brushed past me, she paused deliberately. "Watch and learn, deadweight," she whispered maliciously. "When it truly hits the fan, the company relies on people with actual pedigree. Enjoy staying down here, translating your little, clever walls." With a smug toss of her hair, she stepped into the executive elevator behind Miller. I didn't give her a second thought. I walked back to my desk, sat down, and pulled up the company's internal intranet forum. Vague, frantic leaks from the penthouse boardroom were already starting to surface in real time. Breaking: implosion at the Project Starlight negotiation table. The French and German delegates are screaming at each other over contract discrepancies. Word is our localized drafts were completely sloppy. A minor nuance variance in a single clause just cost a projected valuation gap of hundreds of millions of euros. It's worse than that. The Italian rep feels the phrasing insulted their cultural heritage. He's currently packing his briefcase to walk out. Holy hell, the entire 10-nation alliance is in total chaos. The CEO's face is literally turning green. The feed refreshed rapidly, line after line. The entire corporate headquarters was paralyzed with anxiety. This project was the crown jewel of Apex International. If it crashed, it wouldn't just mean a staggering financial hemorrhage, it would deal a fatal, permanent blow to the firm's global credibility. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, my fingers gently tapping a rhythmic pattern on the desk. I knew with absolute certainty that Miller and Cece couldn't defuse this bomb. Their expertise was strictly confined to routine, boilerplate corporate translation. But this specific contract crossed the hyper-complex intersections of international law, high finance, bleeding-edge tech, and deep historical cultural nuances. Every single word was a hidden landmine. Furthermore, managing 10 distinct national languages meant juggling 10 completely separate cultural psychology profiles and negotiation styles simultaneously. This wasn't a standard translation job. This was a war of attrition. Around me, the remaining employees were whispering frantically. Do you think Cece and the seniors can lock it down? Unlikely. I heard these foreign delegates are elite tier, absolute sharks. Honestly, Miller shouldn't have blasted Vivian like that right before the crisis. What if she actually knew something? Are you kidding? Her? What does she know? How to translate intellectual property into a clever wall. Give me a break. A wave of snickers rippled through the room. I shut down the internet forum, closed my eyes, and rested my head against the chair. I was waiting for Miller's elite line of defense to be thoroughly obliterated. Waiting for the CEO's patience to be ground down to absolute zero. Waiting for the exact moment when they realized they had no choice but to beg for my help. Minutes ticked away. Roughly half an hour later, the double doors of the localization department were violently thrown open. A frantic figure stumbled into the room. It was Cece. Her immaculate, high-end makeup was completely smeared from sweat and panic. Her hair was a messy nest, her face drained of color, and her eyes wide with unadulterated terror. The proud, untouchable princess of the department was entirely gone. It's over. It's all completely ruined, she muttered, her voice hollow and trembling. The French delegate accuses our translation of being insultingly arrogant and demands a public apology. The German delegate just produced a 300-page technical addendum and demands a live, line-by-line translation on the spot. The Russian representative gave up entirely and is just roaring in Russian. No one can comprehend a word. Manager Miller had a full-blown hypertensive panic attack. He passed out and was just carried away by paramedics. The office erupted into a frenzy of panicked chatter. The entire department was paralyzed by the news. Their finest, most elite team had been utterly crushed within 30 minutes when faced with a true global crisis. Cece looked around wildly, searching for a desperate lifeline. Suddenly, her frantic eyes locked onto me. Vivian. Right, Vivian. Her voice cracked, turning into a desperate sob as she sprinted to my desk. Don't you know Portuguese? Go up. Go to the penthouse right now. At least fix that one account. She grabbed my arm with a tight, iron grip, her manicured nails digging painfully into my skin. I slowly opened my eyes, looking at her with absolute serenity. I am just a piece of trash who translates clever walls, I replied, my voice light, completely devoid of emotion. What good could I possibly do up there? Cece froze. She stared into my clear, ice-cold eyes, looking at me as if she were seeing a stranger for the very first time. You. Her lips trembled, but she couldn't forge a single coherent word. Right then, my desk phone rang. It was Linda, the chief executive officer's personal secretary. Her voice was audibly crying through the line. Is this Vivian Vance? Mr. Ross orders you to the penthouse boardroom immediately. I don't care what methods you have to use. Please, I beg of you, stabilize those delegates. Mr. Ross said to tell you, if you can fix this, you can name any price, any position in this company. I hung up the receiver. Under the stunned, breathless gazes of Cece and the entire department. I slowly rose from my chair. I slipped off the cheap, ill-fitting corporate blazer I always wore, revealing a perfectly tailored, premium silk blouse underneath. I reached up and pulled off the plain elastic band that had held my hair in a messy bun for 3 months. My smooth, dark hair fell like a silk waterfall down my shoulders. Step by step, I walked toward the department exit. My high heels clicked against the marble floor, each strike sounding sharp, firm, and entirely authoritative. With each step, the aura of the clumsy rookie vanished, replaced by an imposing, regal presence. At the threshold, I paused and glanced back over my shoulder. My eyes swept across every single dumbfounded face in the room. Finally, my gaze rested on Cece's deathly pale face. I offered her a razor-thin, elegant smile. "Watch closely," I said softly. "This is how a real master operates." 04. The penthouse floor of Apex International, the CEO's exclusive executive suite. The pristine white marble floors were polished to a mirror shine, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive room fragrance and even more expensive corporate panic. I stepped out of the private elevator. At the far end of the long corridor stood the heavy mahogany doors that held the fate of the entire conglomerate. The doors were slightly ajar, and a chaotic symphony of overlapping foreign languages roared from within, sounding like a pack of enraged lions. Linda, the CEO's executive assistant, was pacing frantically outside the entrance. The moment her eyes landed on me, her expression shifted as if she were looking at a savior. She sprinted over. "Vivian, thank God you're finally here." Her voice was violently shaking, her eyes bloodshot. I nodded calmly, my gaze cutting past her toward the doors. "What's the current damage status?" Linda looked on the verge of a total breakdown. "A complete train wreck. Monsieur Martin, the French rep, claims our localized draft insulted his native tongue and is demanding a formal corporate apology before he walks out. Herr Schmidt, the German lead, stated our technical translation reads like a children's book and called it a bad faith fraud. He just slammed a 300-page German document on the table and is demanding a real-time, legally binding translation right now. And Mr. Ivanov, the Russian delegate, he's been roaring in Russian for 30 minutes. No one has a clue what he's saying, but he looks ready to flip the entire conference table." She swallowed hard, dropping her voice to a whisper. Cece and her team couldn't even formulate a single sentence. They were completely paralyzed. Manager Miller's blood pressure spiked so badly he collapsed. They just wheeled him out. I listened, my facial expression unchanging. Everything was unfolding exactly as my predictive algorithms had anticipated. "Where's Mr. Ross?" "The CEO is inside, losing his mind." I extended my hand to push open the heavy double doors. Linda instinctively caught my arm, her eyes filled with a desperate, uncertain anxiety. "Vivian, are you absolutely sure you can handle this? This isn't just a Portuguese file anymore. This is a multinational linguistic battlefield. After all, according to my fabricated corporate file, I was just a poorly performing nepotism hire who couldn't even handle standard business English." I didn't bother to give her a verbal reassurance. I merely cast a cold, sharp glance down at her hand. Slowly, deliberately, I brushed her fingers off my arm. I threw open the heavy oak doors. The scene inside the boardroom was far more feral than Linda had described. A dozen foreign executives of various ethnicities were scattered around the massive ring-shaped conference table. Some were shouting into their phones, others were engaged in fierce arguments, and a few were aggressively packing their briefcases, prepared to abandon the negotiation entirely. Donald Ross, the CEO of Apex International, a man in his mid-50s who was renowned for his unflappable composure, was standing at the head of the table. Sweat was pouring down his forehead as he repeatedly hissed at his remaining VPs, "Calm them down. Find a solution now." Meanwhile, Cece's elite colleagues were huddled in the corner like a flock of terrified birds, faces completely drained of color, not daring to lift their heads. My entrance didn't create an immediate stir among the chaos. Only the translators cowering near the door noticed me. Cece's friend looked up, her expression shifting from confusion to instant disdain, and finally to a sneer of pure jealousy. Her face screamed, "What is this piece of trash doing up here?" I walked right past them. I marched directly through the frantic crowd, stopping right at the geographical center of the massive conference table. I picked up an empty crystal water glass, unclipped a premium fountain pen from my pocket, and lightly struck the rim. Ting! The crisp, high-frequency sound wasn't loud, but it possessed a peculiar, commanding resonance that pierced through the noise. The shouting in the room faltered for a fraction of a second. I seized that exact second. I opened my mouth, speaking in a flawless, perfectly enunciated received pronunciation British accent. "Ladies and gentlemen." My voice wasn't booming, yet it carried an underlying authority that reached every corner of the vast room. I am Vivian Vance, Chief Legal and Localization Consultant for Apex International. Every head snapped in my direction. The foreign delegates stared at me with calculating, impatient eyes. CEO Donald Ross and his high-level VPs looked utterly dumbfounded. The translators in the corner looked like they had just seen a ghost. I swept my gaze across the room, my eyes locking onto the most furious man in the room, Monsieur Martin, the French representative. I instantly switched languages. My voice transformed into an elegant, classical Parisian French. "Monsieur Martin, je vous présente mes plus sincères excuses au nom de l'entreprise pour cette traduction ô combien fastidieuse. Accords nous 6 minutes, non 5 minutes. Je vous apporterai une réponse pleinement satisfaisante. Monsieur Martin, I offer my sincerest apologies on behalf of the company for our incredibly tedious translation. Grant us 10 minutes, no, 5 minutes. I will provide you with a completely satisfactory resolution." Martin froze. His wide blue eyes, previously blazing with anger, widened further with absolute shock. He hadn't expected a young woman to articulate such pristine, upper-class French, let alone deliberately weaponize the exact word he had used during his tirade, fastidious, tedious/annoying. This wasn't mere translation. This was high-level diplomatic negotiation. It was an equal, authoritative, and deeply calming communication. Before he could even process a reply, I spun sharply toward Herr Schmidt, the man gripping the 300-page German technical addendum. My language shifted seamlessly once more. It became a rigid, hyper-precise, mechanically flawless German. "Herr Schmidt, Ihr Hingeben die deutsche Grundlichkeit ist absolut bewundernswert. Dieses 300-seitige Dokument ist in der Tat eine Herausforderung, aber der Kern des Problems lässt sich womöglich auf einen einzigen Satz reduzieren. Bitte geben Sie mir eine Minute." Herr Schmidt, your dedication to German thoroughness is absolutely admirable. This 300-page document is indeed a challenge, but the core of the problem can likely be reduced to a single sentence. Please give me 1 minute. Schmidt's notoriously stern, stoic face cracked, revealing a look of pure incredulity. Finally, my eyes locked onto the massive Russian executive no one could pacify, Mr. Ivanov. He was still muttering gruffly under his breath. I offered him a subtle, poised smile. This time, my vocal register adopted the grand, robust, and direct cadence of native Slavic syntax. "Respected Mr. Ivanov, I understand your anger perfectly, but rage solves no problems. Perhaps we should start by drinking a glass of water and sorting this out calmly." The moment the final syllable left my lips, the entire executive boardroom fell into a dead, tomb-like silence. The multinational delegates, who had been on the verge of a riot moments ago, were now staring at me as if I were some supernatural anomaly. CEO Ross and his top executives had their mouths open wide enough to swallow a golf ball. Cece's elite colleagues were entirely petrified, looking as though they had forgotten how to breathe. I stood dead center under the lights, completely unfazed. I turned to the CEO. "Mr. Ross, please provide me with a completely isolated private office, a high-spec laptop with maximum network clearance, and exactly 15 minutes. Furthermore, have Linda forward every single raw electronic draft of the 10 contracts to my secure internal email immediately. The crisis is over. The show begins." The final sentence was delivered in a pure, lyrical Italian, carrying a dramatic, operatic cadence. It was aimed directly at the Italian representative sitting silently in the far corner, who had previously checked out of the entire meeting. The Italian executive lifted his head, his eyes flashing for the very first time with an expression called absolute fascination. 05. CEO Ross personally escorted me into his adjacent, high-security private lounge. The room was completely soundproofed, entirely cut off from the external chaos. Miss Vance, no, Consultant Vance, Ross's form of address shifted instantly, his voice dripping with sudden reverence. Whatever resources you require, just name it. I didn't bother looking at him as I unpacked my things. A laptop. Ensure my network privileges are upgraded to Tier 1 administrator clearance immediately. Have all 10 language versions of the original raw contracts sent to my inbox within 60 seconds. A cup of black, unsweetened Americano. I paused, my eyes cutting to his. And ensure Linda guards that door. No one enters, no one calls, for the next 15 minutes. Total radio silence. Ross nodded frantically, looking exactly like a scolded elementary schooler standing before a principal. Right away. I will handle it personally. He practically sprinted out of the lounge to execute the orders. Within moments, a top-tier workstation laptop and a steaming cup of black coffee were placed before me. A sharp notification chimed from my email client. 10 heavily encrypted data files were sitting in my inbox. I walked over, locked the heavy lounge door, and bolted it shut. The entire world vanished into absolute quiet. I picked up the coffee cup but didn't take a sip. I merely let the intense heat radiate into my palms. 8 years. For 8 long years in Europe and the corporate battlegrounds abroad, I had survived on less than 4 hours of sleep a night. To secure dual doctoral degrees, to master not just the vocabulary, but the deep cultural psychology and logical systems behind 10 separate languages, I had transformed myself into a relentless machine. Everything I had sacrificed was engineered for this precise day. To tear back every single thing that had been stolen from my father, Charles Vance. And Apex International was merely my opening gambit. I aggressively cleared the memories from my mind, my gaze sharpening as I stared at the twin monitors. 15 minutes. I was going to resolve a multi-billion-dollar international corporate standoff in 900 seconds. To anyone else, it was a delusional fantasy. To me, it was a warm-up exercise. I took a sharp breath and my fingers dropped onto the mechanical keyboard. Speed. Absolute, blinding speed. My 10 fingers blurred across the keys, moving so rapidly they left visual trails. On the screens, thousands of lines of contract code and interface windows cascaded past my eyes. I wasn't using a single commercial translation program. I was booting up my own creation, the crown jewel of my dark network operations, a proprietary translation and strategic decision engine system named Babel. Babel Framework, initiating. Core Global Database, fully loaded. Cultural Contextual Module, commencing algorithmic alignment. Legal Landmine Scanner, active. File number 1, the French delegation's contract. The core anomaly was located within seconds. The original Apex translation team had literally translated a clause regarding collaborative equity into a term that meant predatory profit extraction. In French high-end corporate culture, that specific phrasing carried an incredibly aggressive, greedy undertone. It read as arrogant and insulting. I purged the text, replacing it with a nuanced term that translated to symmetrical prosperity. Beneath the clause, I appended a famous quote by Victor Hugo as an explanatory footnote, seamlessly contextualizing the cultural alignment. Time elapsed, 1 minute. Fixed. File number 2, the German delegate's 300-page technical addendum. I didn't waste time reading all 300 pages. The Babel engine executed a semantic scan and logical mapping, pinpointing the critical conflict within 3 seconds. The previous translation team had botched a decimal point regarding component tolerance parameters, accidentally loosening the manufacturing strictness by a factor of 10. To a traditional German engineer, that wasn't a typo, that was an insult to their industrial heritage, a sign of fraudulent negligence. I corrected the parameter across the entire index, then drafted a response note in flawless High German. We apologize for our failure to mirror the exceptional rigor of your engineering standards. We look forward to executing flawless perfection alongside your team. Time elapsed, 3 minutes. Fixed. File number 3, the Russian contract. Babel's psychological context analyzer indicated that Mr. Ivanov's fury didn't stem from the legal terminology itself, but rather from the incredibly sluggish, bureaucratic pace of the American negotiation style. He was a classic, old-school Russian executive. He demanded direct respect and maximum velocity. I bypassed the fluff and drafted a remarkably concise, ironclad Russian memorandum. I stripped away the corporate filler, mapping the core terms into a clean, numbered index of absolute clarity. At the footer, I added a localized idiom, looking forward to sealing this alliance with a man of action like Mr. Ivanov, followed by a proper glass of vodka. Time elapsed, 1 minute. Fixed. Spanish, Italian, Japanese, Korean, Arabic, Swedish. Document after document was dissected, re-engineered, and finalized under my flying fingers. My brain was operating like an overlocked central processing unit. 10 separate languages, 10 distinct matrices of human thought, running in parallel execution inside my skull without a single collision. The cup of Americano shifted from boiling to lukewarm and finally to cold. I never touched a drop. 14 minutes and 50 seconds. I hit the command key, transmitting the 10th finalized portfolio back to the main server. Simultaneously, I compiled a master executive summary in English and blasted it to the CEO's personal tablet. The clock struck exactly 15 minutes. I stood up, stretching my stiff fingers, and unbolted the heavy oak door. The moment the door swung open, I found CEO Ross, Linda, and the entire executive board standing outside like a row of frozen statues. They stared at me, their faces twisted with an agonizing mixture of terror and desperate hope. Consultant Vance, how's it looking? Ross's voice was completely hoarse. I smoothly snapped my laptop shut and handed it to Linda. The crisis is fully contained. The French contract has been fully repolished with appropriate cultural annotations. Monsieur Martin will find it impeccable. The core engineering parameter error in the German addendum has been corrected, complete with a formal alignment statement. The Russian delegate required operational velocity. His optimized memorandum is in his inbox. The Italian rep demanded respect and artistic symmetry. I incorporated a relevant line from Dante's Inferno into the preamble. The Japanese require humility and microdetail. I adjusted the honorific syntax across their entire annex. With every sentence I uttered, the eyes of the executives widened another inch. They stared at me as if they were looking at a deity. A literal god who had single-handedly pacified a 10-nation storm in 900 seconds. Before anyone could speak, a chaotic chorus of ping and chime notifications erupted from every executive's cell phone in the corridor. It was the automated receipts from the delegation leads. Linda's hands shook so violently she almost dropped her tablet as she pulled up the first notification. She read it aloud, her voice cracking, from Monsieur Martin of the French delegation. Magnificent. Exquisite. This is true diplomatic artistry. I completely withdraw our complaints, accept your elegant apology, and look forward to signing the final papers. CEO Ross scrambled to unlock his own phone, his eyes widening. Herr Schmidt just replied. He writes, impeccable precision. Phenomenal rigor. We are deeply impressed to see the authentic spirit of thoroughness mirrored by your brilliant consultant. Mr. Ivanov, he just texted our VP, another executive yelled. He says, good girl. Tell that translator she's a powerhouse. Once the ink is dry, she owes me that drink. Message after message flooded the network. Pure praise. Absolute validation. The explosive rage that had threatened to tear Apex International apart 30 minutes ago had completely dissolved, as if it had never existed. Ross's face flushed a deep, ecstatic crimson. He lunged forward, grabbing my hand and shaking it with manic energy. A savior. No, an absolute prodigy. You just saved the entire corporate legacy of Apex International. I smoothly, coldly pulled my hand from his grip. My gaze bypassed the celebrating executives, cutting straight across the hall to the elevator banks. Cece and her elite translation colleagues were standing there, completely frozen, having just come up to witness the aftermath. Their faces were a horrifying display of shock, deep-seated envy, and a mounting, suffocating terror. I looked at them, and a slow, dangerous smile spread across my face. As I had said before, the performance had only just begun. 06. The crisis was entirely dead. Inside the grand boardroom, the entire atmosphere had done a complete 180-degree flip. The 10-nation delegates, who had been ready to rip each other's throats out an hour prior, were now crowding around my chair like a group of fascinated university students. They began throwing incredibly complex, highly advanced linguistic and legal paradoxes at me in their respective native tongues. They tested me on everything from the subtle nuances of French subjunctive conjugations to the hyperdense compound syntax of German corporate law to the intricate multi-tiered honorific structures of high-level Japanese diplomacy. It was partly a test, but mostly the highest form of professional reverence. I moved through them like a grandmaster on a chessboard. Every language was deployed with effortless grace. Every single query was answered with absolute fluency, complete with citations of historical legal precedents and cultural etymology to expand on my points. Inside my mind, the Babel database had already synthesized this knowledge into second nature. I wasn't merely translating words, I was demonstrating a supreme mastery over the cultural civilizational matrix behind the languages. The eyes of the foreign delegates shifted from mere professional appreciation to outright professional worship. CEO Ross and his top-tier VPs were reduced to background decorations. They stood at the edge of the room, wearing stiff, proud, yet utterly bewildered smiles, unable to contribute a single word to the high-level dialogue. The scene was both comical and entirely telling. Cece and her elite circle had long been quietly escorted out of the room by Linda. I could easily imagine the look of absolute ruin on their faces right now. This impromptu international academic symposium dragged on for nearly an hour. Finally, after Ross extended multiple polite invitations, the delegates reluctantly adjourned to the executive dining hall for the ceremonial banquet. Before leaving, every single delegate made it a point to walk over and shake my hand with profound solemnity. Herr Schmidt of Germany looked at me and stated, "Miss Vance, your unparalleled intellect commands my utmost respect for the younger generation of your country." Monsieur Martin of France went so far as to offer an elegant double baiser on my cheeks. If you ever decide to relocate to Paris, the doors of every luxury conglomerate on the Champs-Élysées are permanently open to you. The heavy boardroom finally emptied, leaving only me, CEO Ross, and his inner circle of core executives. Ross let out a massive, chest-heaving sigh of relief, looking like a soldier who had just survived a brutal siege. "Consultant Vance, today I have truly witnessed a miracle." He walked over to the sideboard and personally poured a cup of premium hot tea, placing it before me with his own hands. "On behalf of Apex International, I extend my deepest gratitude to you. Before today, I was utterly blind. To think a talent of your caliber was buried in a low-level cubicle in the localization unit, enduring such toxic mistreatment." I picked up the porcelain cup, gently blowing across the steaming surface. "You are too kind, Mr. Ross. Apex pays my salary, and I merely perform my duties. It's simply business." My response was a masterclass in corporate diplomacy, flawless, professional, and completely unreadable. But Ross was an old shark. He caught the underlying weight behind my words. He knew it was time to pay the piper and fulfill the promise Linda had delivered on his behalf. "Consultant Vance, the words Linda conveyed to you over the phone carry the full, legally binding weight of my office. If you choose to remain at Apex, you can dictate any terms you desire. Title, salary, equity packages, none of it is an issue. You will report directly and exclusively to me." He threw down an executive olive branch that would make any corporate climber in the country go insane with greed. The remaining VPs stared at me with eyes full of intense envy. A meteoric ascent straight to the corporate heavens, handed on a silver platter. I set the teacup down, lifted my head, and locked my eyes onto his. Mr. Ross, I have absolutely zero interest in a corporate title or a standard salary increase. My words caused the entire room to stumble. The eager smile on Ross's face froze instantly. Then, what exactly are you looking for? I mean that what I am truly after, Apex International might not be able to afford. I leaned back against the leather chair, my tone casual, yet carrying an absolute, non-negotiable weight. However, since you have offered, I will present 3 minor conditions. First, I extended a single finger. I require complete, unilateral authority over the restructuring of the localization and translation department. Ross nodded instantly without hesitation. Absolutely. Parasites like Marcus Miller and Cece, who compromise our talent, must be dealt with immediately. I will have HR issue their termination papers tomorrow. I raised a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. No, Mr. Ross, you misunderstand me. The restructuring I am talking about isn't as simple as firing a couple of low-level employees. I demand that from this exact hour forward, every single personnel appointment, project allocation, and performance matrix within that department is subject entirely and exclusively to my personal veto. In other words, I am taking absolute, solitary command of the entire localization division. Hiss! A sharp chorus of indrawn breaths echoed through the boardroom. This wasn't a standard promotion request. This was an executive coup. A naked, ruthless seizure of institutional power. Ross's expression shifted, his brow furrowing. He hadn't anticipated my appetite to be this ravenous. The localization division wasn't our core profit center, but it was a vital operational organ, and handing over total, unchecked personnel autonomy was a massive corporate taboo. I ignored his hesitation and extended a second finger. Second, I demand a thorough, unrestricted forensic audit into the individuals responsible for the Project Starlight translation sabotage, not just Marcus Miller and Cece as the grunts on the floor. I want a full disclosure of who approved the initial, fundamentally flawed contract copy before it reached my desk. Who signed off on the internal compliance chain? Who cleared the final quality assurance metrics? I want a complete, comprehensive map of accountability from the very top of the executive ladder to the bottom. Not a single link omitted. If my first condition was a seizure of power, this second condition was a declaration of war. It was a clear intent to excavate the deeply entrenched, corrupt shadow networks operating beneath the company's surface. Cold sweat began to bead on Ross's forehead once more. He was a seasoned executive. His instincts warned him that the waters I was trying to stir were far deeper and darker than he could see. I stared directly into his eyes and extended my third finger. Third. My voice dropped lower, turning into an icy, razor-sharp whisper. I require the company to reopen a full corporate investigation into a specific individual. A man named Charles Vance. He was one of the original co-founders of Apex International, and he was my father. 15 years ago, he was systematically ousted from the board of directors over a fabricated commercial espionage scandal. He died of a broken heart shortly after. I demand that Apex International officially launch a full-scale corporate inquiry into the exact parameters of that case. I want to know whether my father was truly guilty or if he was ruthlessly framed by people still sitting in this very building. I want the absolute, unvarnished truth. The moment the final word left my lips, the temperature inside the massive boardroom plummeted to absolute zero. Ross stared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of raw shock and sudden, paralyzing horror. The puzzle pieces finally clicked together in his mind. I hadn't returned to Apex International for a high-paying corporate career, nor for a petty management title. I had returned for blood. I was here for vengeance. This is... Ross's lips trembled, his voice failing him. This matter had completely broken past the boundaries of what a standard chief executive officer could control. It touched the dark, foundational history of the conglomerate itself. I stood up, smoothing down the front of my silk blouse, and walked over to him. You don't need to give me your answer this afternoon, Mr. Ross. Take my conditions, present them to the board of directors, and deliver them directly to those high and mighty old friends of my father who still sit comfortably on their thrones. I offered him a flawless, elegant smile that carried a terrifying, bone-chilling coldness. Deliver them a simple message from me. Tell them that Vivian Vance has finally come home. 07. By the time I walked back down to the localization department, dusk had already fallen over the city. The entire department was still there. Not a single employee had left their desk. They weren't working overtime. They were waiting. Waiting for their collective judgment day. The open office was dead silent, the oppressive atmosphere thick enough to suffocate someone. Cece and the other seniors who had accompanied Miller to the penthouse were sitting stiffly at their desks like convicted criminals waiting for the executioner, their heads buried low. The remaining staff members watched me, their eyes filled with a potent mix of reverence, shock, and intense curiosity as I walked through the floor. I didn't acknowledge a single one of them. I marched directly to Marcus Miller's closed office door. I didn't bother knocking. I simply gripped the metal handle, turned it, and threw the door open. Inside the office, Marcus Miller was sitting slumped in his high-back leather executive chair, looking completely depleted. He hadn't actually remained unconscious. After being stabilized by the corporate medical staff, he had locked himself inside his office, refusing to see anyone. The sudden sound of the door opening made him snap his head up. The moment his eyes locked onto me, his pupils dilated with sudden terror, and the remaining color drained from his face. "You? What do you think you're doing in here?" His voice was hoarse, trembling with unmasked fear. The woman standing before him now bore absolutely no resemblance to the clumsy, submissive charity case he had spent 3 months screaming at. I reached back, closed the heavy door behind me, but didn't lock it. I walked over to his mahogany desk, pulled out the leather chair directly opposite him, and sat down smoothly. My movements were slow, deliberate, and entirely poised, as if I were the true owner of the space. "Manager Miller, I trust your health has stabilized?" I asked casually, my tone sounding like an old friend making polite conversation. My calm demeanor only served to escalate his internal panic. I am fine." "Splendid," I nodded, leaning forward slightly. "I was under the impression we might need to summon an ambulance to cart you away permanently." I reached out and picked up a heavy crystal paperweight from his desk, turning it over idly in my hand. "Manager Miller, how long have you been employed at Apex International?" 15 years. 15 years. A substantial tenure, I remarked, my eyes fixed on the crystal. Climbing from a low-level translator all the way to the head of a division, that must have required an immense amount of effort, yes? Miller had no idea what kind of trap I was setting, so he could only stammer out a vague agreement. "Yes, it wasn't easy." "Indeed," I said, suddenly setting the crystal down with a sharp thud against the wood, my gaze snapping up to lock onto his face like twin laser beams. Which is exactly why a rational person should cherish their career, shouldn't they? Using a position you spent 15 years bleeding for just to play tyrant, abuse corporate rookies, and stroke your own petty ego. Don't you find that behavior incredibly moronic? A cold sweat erupted across Miller's forehead instantly. "Consultant Vance. I was blind before. I didn't recognize your true pedigree. Save your breath. You don't need to apologize to me," I interrupted coldly. "I didn't walk into this office to listen to your pathetic sniveling." I slid the crystal paperweight to the edge of the desk. "I am here to inform you of 3 distinct developments. First, effective immediately, I am taking absolute command of the localization and translation department. Every single shred of your operational authority has been frozen." Miller's face turned an administrative shade of gray. Is this CEO Ross's official directive?" "You can consider it a direct reflection of his will," I replied smoothly, completely bypassing his question. Second, I reached into my premium leather portfolio, pulled out a document, and slid it across the desk until it hit his chest. "This is the initial forensic accountability report regarding the Project Starlight translation incident. I require your signature at the bottom." Miller's hands shook like a leaf as he picked up the pages. The moment his eyes scanned the text, his pupils dilated with absolute horror. The dossier didn't just outline his gross managerial negligence regarding the Starlight contracts. It contained a meticulously documented, line-by-line financial audit proving that over the past 3 fiscal years, He had been systematically inflating translation budgets and outsourcing core Apex projects to a shell localization agency registered under his wife's maiden name, pocketing millions in corporate kickbacks. Every single transaction, every routing number, every wire transfer date, and every exact amount was listed, calculated precisely to 2 decimal places. You. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his voice cracking with pure terror. Who the hell are you? How could you possibly have access to these records? These financial loops were his deeply buried dirty secrets. Outside of himself and his wife, it was mathematically impossible for a third party to possess this data. I offered him a low, dangerous laugh. Manager Miller, have you already forgotten my primary skill set? I am a master of data, language, and structures. And in the modern digital landscape, syntax and financial records are entirely identical. If I desire to excavate a piece of data, there isn't an encryption matrix on this planet that can keep your secrets buried. My proprietary Babel architecture wasn't merely a translation tool, it was engineered as one of the world's most sophisticated data harvesting and intelligence analysis systems. Miller's primitive corporate fraud looked like a child's crayon drawing in front of it. Miller collapsed back into his chair, the light entirely dying in his eyes. He knew, with absolute certainty, that he was utterly destroyed. If this dossier was forwarded to federal prosecutors, he wouldn't just lose his career, he would be spending the next 2 decades in a federal penitentiary. I'll sign. He grabbed a pen, his hand shaking so violently he looked like a neurological patient. Excellent, I murmured, watching him scrawl his name across the compliance clause. Now for the third item. I stood up, towering over him as he sat broken in his chair. Ensure every single piece of your personal property is cleared out of this room before 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. Because starting tomorrow, this office belongs to me. Without waiting for a reply, I turned on my heels, threw open the door, and stepped out. Outside the office, the entire department was gathered in a tight circle. The acoustic design of the floor wasn't completely soundproof. They had heard every single syllable of my conversation with Miller. Every gaze fixed on me was now dripping with an intense, paralyzing terror. I let my eyes slowly scan the open floor. Finally, my gaze locked onto Cece, who was leaning against a pillar, looking as though she were about to faint from fear. I extended a single hand and crooked a finger at her. Cece, step forward. My voice was quiet, yet it carried the weight of a divine execution order. Cece's entire body shuddered. She forced her stiff legs to move, dragging her feet until she stood 3 feet away from me. Consultant Vance. Drop the title, I said smoothly. I much prefer the designation you used for me over the past 3 months. Go ahead. Call me Charity Case again. Cece's face instantly flushed a sickening, violent crimson, humiliation, and intense terror twisting her features. I wouldn't dare. You wouldn't dare? I let out a sharp, cutting laugh. You seemed exceptionally daring when you were humiliating me in front of the team. You looked incredibly powerful when you were pouring scalding black coffee across my desk, didn't you? It must have felt spectacular to shout across the office, calling me a useless nobody who crawled through a backroom. With every sentence I delivered, Cece's face grew whiter. Finally, her knees buckled, and she dropped straight down onto the marble floor, sobbing hysterically. I was wrong. Consultant Vance, I was completely wrong. I was blind. I am an absolute fool who couldn't recognize a true master. Please, I beg of you, give me one more chance. Don't ruin me. She reached out, desperately trying to grab the hem of my trousers, tears streaming down her face. The remaining employees didn't dare to breathe a single breath. What were they witnessing? The arrogant, untouchable queen of the department was currently groveling on the floor like a stray dog begging for scraps. And all of this was happening because she had crossed the one woman they had collectively spent 3 months mocking as trash. The sheer, terrifying whiplash of reality left an indelible scar on everyone's psyche. A singular, absolute realization locked into their minds. Vivian Vance is a monster you never, under any circumstances, cross. I looked down at the weeping girl groveling at my feet, my expression entirely void of human empathy. Another chance? I granted you multiple chances, Cece. The moment you threw that coffee at me, the moment you mocked my choice of software, the moment you stepped into the penthouse elevator and turned back to deliver one last insult. Regrettably, you blew every single lifeline I threw you. I lifted my foot, smoothly but firmly brushing her hands away from my leg. Tomorrow morning, hand your corporate badge to HR alongside Miller. Pack your desk and leave the building. Apex International has absolutely no requirement for elites of your caliber. Ignoring her desperate, choked wails, I walked past her over to my old cubicle and began gathering my things. The cheap corporate stationery, the outdated reference manuals, I left them all behind. I merely reached into the absolute deepest corner of the desk drawer and pulled out a small, plain wooden photo frame. Inside the frame was a photograph of a refined, scholarly middle-aged man holding a young girl of 7 or 8 in his arms. The man was my late father, Charles Vance. The little girl was me. I gently wiped a thin layer of dust from the glass and slid the frame into my premium leather bag. Then I walked back to the center of the floor, paused at the threshold of the manager's office, and delivered my final announcement to the silent room. Tomorrow morning at exactly 9 a.m., a mandatory all-hands strategic meeting will commence in the main boardroom. Any individual who is even 1 second late will be processed as an immediate, voluntary resignation. 08. The following morning, 8:50 a.m. The central boardroom of the localization and translation department was packed to maximum capacity. Not a single employee dared to be late. In fact, the collective breathing in the room was noticeably subdued, as if everyone were trying to minimize their physical presence. Every single staff member sat perfectly straight, looking exactly like terrified soldiers awaiting a high-level military inspection. The corner office that had belonged to Marcus Miller for 15 years had been completely overhauled overnight. Every single trace of his personal property had been purged, leaving behind only a sleek, high-end minimalist corporate workstation setup. And the acrylic nameplate on the door that read Marcus Miller, Division Head, had been stripped away. A new premium metallic nameplate hung in its place, deeply engraved with 2 pristine words: Vivian Vance. At exactly 9 a.m., I threw open the boardroom doors and stepped inside. I was dressed in a perfectly tailored, sharp black double-breasted power suit, my long hair tied back into a flawless, commanding ponytail. My gaze was razor-sharp, my executive aura entirely dominant. The clumsy, hesitant intern in the cheap polyester shirt from yesterday had completely vanished. I marched to the head of the long conference table, placed my high-spec laptop down, and let my eyes slowly sweep across the room. Every employee who caught my gaze instinctively lowered their head, avoiding eye contact at all costs. The seats previously occupied by Marcus Miller and Cece were completely empty. They hadn't shown up. Word had already trickled down that at 8 a.m. sharp, both individuals had quietly submitted their formal resignations to HR and snuck out of the building with their personal items, looking thoroughly broken. I have called this mandatory briefing to establish 3 critical operational directives. I opened directly, my voice crisp, clean, and entirely devoid of emotional fluff. First, regarding organizational command. As of this hour, I am assuming total, unilateral control over all operations within this division. I expect every individual to rapidly calibrate to my operational velocity and standards. My parameters are remarkably simple: absolute efficiency, flawless precision, and uncompromised institutional loyalty. Those who can execute will remain. For those who cannot, the doors to HR remain unlocked permanently. The room remained dead silent. Not a single person dared to mutter a protest. Second, regarding Project Starlight. I opened my laptop, and a complex system schematic was instantly projected onto the massive central screen. I have personally re-engineered the entire translation pipeline and quality assurance architecture based on the specific psychological and structural profiles of the 10-nation alliance. Moving forward, every single localized draft must undergo a rigorous 3-tier validation matrix: initial translation, cross-symmetrical peer review, and final AI-driven algorithmic audit. The final audit phase will be executed exclusively through my proprietary system, Babel. Any structural error, punctuation variance, or contextual misalignment will be automatically flagged by the engine. The automated metrics generated by Babel will directly dictate your quarterly performance bonuses and contract renewals. On the screen, the highly advanced, hyper-futuristic system interface of the Babel network, alongside a dense matrix of incredibly strict compliance parameters, caused the seasoned corporate veterans in the room to break into a collective cold sweat. They realized with absolute horror that the days of coasting along, taking lazy shortcuts, and turning in sloppy work were officially dead. Third, I snapped my laptop shut, my eyes pinning the room. Regarding the macro destiny of this department. Under previous management, this division was treated as a passive support unit, a low-level cost center hidden in the background. But under my command, this department will transform into the sharpest intelligence weapon Apex International possesses. We will operate as a high-tier strategic intelligence hub and market analysis core. I do not require standard dictionary translators. I require elite specialists who possess a deep comprehension of the geopolitical, commercial, and socio-historical matrices behind the languages they deploy. In return, I will grant you access to world-class training resources, bleeding-edge proprietary tools, and the most high-stakes projects in the industry. And naturally, your financial compensation will be upgraded to the absolute highest tier of industry standards. My opening address was a masterclass in executive leadership, balancing intense operational pressure with massive career incentives. It injected an immediate, electrifying sense of high-stakes purpose into a department that had been culturally rotting for a decade. My directives have been established. If anyone possesses a rational query, you may voice it now. The boardroom remained dead quiet for several long moments. Finally, an older, senior translator wearing wire-rimmed glasses slowly, hesitantly raised his hand. His name was Wayne, the longest-serving veteran in the unit outside of Miller. Manager Vance. I would like to inquire regarding the Starlight incident. Now that Miller and CC have resigned, does the corporate accountability investigation conclude with them? The question voiced the absolute terror gripping every employee in the room. They were petrified that my corporate purge would continue down the ladder to incinerate them. I looked at Wayne, offering him a subtle, poised smile. Wayne, your question cuts right to the heart of the matter. Marcus Miller and CC are merely the low-level grease trapped at the bottom of the machine. They were the executioners on the floor, but they were certainly not the architects of the sabotage. I tapped my trackpad, and a new document flashed onto the projector screen. It was a high-resolution screenshot of a secure internal corporate email. This specific directive was transmitted exactly 2 weeks ago from the Strategic Development Division directly to Miller's private terminal, ordering our unit to handle the initial Starlight draft. The highly flawed, sabotaged contract draft that almost destroyed the company was signed off and cleared through compliance at that exact node. The executive who personally cleared that disastrous copy and pushed it directly to the CEO's desk is the Deputy Director of Strategic Development, Jared Ward. Jared Ward. The moment that name flashed onto the screen, the faces of several senior veterans in the room turned instantly pale. They knew exactly what kind of institutional monster that name represented. Jared Ward. Wayne muttered under his breath, his voice trembling slightly. He's the direct protege and blood relative of Executive Vice President Ward. Executive Vice President Jonathan Ward. The undisputed number 2 executive of Apex International, a core member of the board of directors. And 15 years ago, he was the man who had styled himself as my father's trusted brother before systematically stabbing him in the back and driving him into the abyss. All the loose threads were finally converging onto that massive, corrupt web. I ignored the frantic murmurs of the staff. From a compliance perspective, Deputy Director Jared Ward bears direct, non-negotiable executive responsibility for this catastrophic operational failure. I have already forwarded the complete forensic dossier, alongside the signed confession I extracted from Miller, directly to CEO Ross and the Internal Affairs panel. I am confident that federal and corporate justice will be served with extreme speed. The moment the final syllable left my lips. The heavy double doors of the boardroom were violently kicked open with a thunderous bang. A young executive wearing a custom Armani suit, his hair slicked back with expensive pomade, marched into the room with an expression of unmasked arrogance. He was flanked by two massive, silent corporate security bodyguards. It was Jared Ward himself. He didn't even acknowledge the staff. He marched straight to the head of the table and slammed a printed dossier violently onto my desk. Vivian Vance. Jared glared down at me, his voice dripping with pure venom and executive entitlement. Who the hell gave a low-level rat like you the authority to initiate an internal investigation against me? You think because you pulled off a petty parlor trick in front of the CEO yesterday, you suddenly run Apex International? Let me educate you, little girl. The waters in this building run far deeper than your pathetic mind can comprehend. A worthless nobody like you doesn't stand a chance. Behind him, the two massive bodyguards took an aggressive step forward, effectively cutting off my exit routes. The atmosphere inside the boardroom instantly amplified to a dangerous level of tension. Several female staff members looked on the verge of a panic attack. I looked up at the raging executive standing before me, my expression entirely placid. I merely reached out, picked up the document he had slammed on my desk, and flipped through the pages idly. It was a leaked copy of the formal IA report I had submitted to the CEO an hour ago. The fact that he had secured a copy so quickly proved that his uncle's shadow network had deep roots inside the compliance division. Deputy Director Ward, I presume? I set the report down, my eyes locking onto his with an icy serenity. If you marched into my division to engage in an objective professional dialogue regarding operations, I welcome it. But if you crossed my threshold to issue primitive physical threats, I paused, the corners of my mouth curving into a razor-thin smile. I assure you, you have miscalculated your target. Furthermore, let me remind you of a specific clause. According to Apex Corporate Code Section 37, unauthorized entry into an active departmental briefing, combined with explicit intimidation of a sitting division head, constitutes a Tier 1 severe compliance violation. Based on protocol, I am fully within my rights to have building security remove you from my floor like a common trespasser. Jared was instantly choked by my response, his face flushing a violent, angry crimson. He hadn't anticipated that I would remain completely unfazed by his physical presence, let alone deploy the company's internal compliance codex to pin him down. He let out a furious, unhinged laugh. Brilliant. A remarkably sharp tongue for a dead woman. Let's see if your little compliance codes can stop me from breaking you today. He threw out a sharp hand gesture, and his two massive bodyguards instantly lunged forward to seize my chair. A sharp scream erupted from the back of the room. Yet, I remained entirely motionless in my seat. I didn't even blink. I simply reached into my pocket, pulled out my smartphone, and tapped a speed dial command. The call was accepted within a single ring cycle. Mr. Ross. Deputy Director Jared Ward of the Strategic Development Division has just breached my boardroom mid-briefing alongside two personal bodyguards and is currently initiating physical violence against my person. I am leaving the resolution of this operational hazard entirely in your hands. I ended the call. The entire process took less than 30 seconds. The triumphant smirk on Jared Ward's face froze entirely. 09. Jared Ward's expression did a violent dance, shifting from supreme arrogance to complete bewilderment and finally to a sudden, underlying streak of raw panic. He had never encountered an executive who would completely bypass standard corporate diplomacy to directly summon the chief executive officer over a floor dispute. It shattered every unwritten rule of corporate warfare. Normally, a newly appointed division head facing a deeply entrenched executive with a massive political backing would attempt to de-escalate, or at least leverage middle-tier compliance channels to resolve the conflict privately. Instead, I had chosen the most direct, destructive path available. I had flipped the entire board. You think you're fooling anyone with that pathetic bluff? Jared blustered, his voice betraying a sudden, shaky lack of confidence. You honestly believe CEO Ross is going to jeopardize his entire political relationship with Executive VP Ward over an entry-level manager like you? You are completely delusional. I didn't bother offering him a response. I merely sat there, watching him with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing an insect trapped in a jar. The seconds stretched out, agonizingly slow. The only sound inside the boardroom was the heavy, frantic breathing of Jared Ward. Roughly 60 seconds later, the custom smartphone inside Jared's Armani jacket erupted into a loud, aggressive ringtone. The moment his eyes locked onto the encrypted caller ID, the remaining color drained from his face instantly. It was Executive Vice President Jonathan Ward, his uncle. He didn't dare delay the call. He lunged toward the far corner of the room, answering the phone with a deeply submissive, hunched posture. "VP Ward, yes, sir." Through the premium receiver and muffled, furious roar could be heard echoing from the phone. With every second the voice blasted him, Jared's spine curved lower, his previous arrogance entirely replaced by a terrified, groveling desperation. "Understood. Yes, VP Ward. I assure you, it's a complete misunderstanding. I was simply conducting a routine operational check with Manager Vance." "Of course. Right away, sir. Right away." He terminated the call. By the time he turned back to face the boardroom, his face was plastered with a sickeningly fake, trembling smile. The transition was faster than a theatrical performance. "My apologies, Manager Vance. It seems we had a bit of a miscommunication here. At the end of the day, we are all part of the same Apex family. My temper got the better of me, and I trust you won't hold it against a fellow colleague." He snapped his fingers frantically at his two stunned bodyguards, his eyes flashing with desperate urgency. "What are you two idiots standing there for? Offer Manager Vance your deepest apologies immediately." The two massive men exchanged a bewildered glance, then lowered their heads in unison. "Our deepest apologies, Manager Vance." I sat perfectly still at the head of the table, remaining completely silent. I didn't offer them a single word of forgiveness, nor did I signal for them to leave. Jared's plastic smile began to crack under the weight of my silence. He knew with terrifying certainty that he hadn't escaped the trap. "Manager Vance, if there's nothing else." "Deputy Director Ward," I finally opened, my voice quiet, yet carrying a resonance that cut through the room like a razor blade. "A moment ago, you stated that the corporate waters in this building run exceptionally deep." Jared's posture stiffened instantly. "I happen to be an avid deep-sea diver. The darker and more hazardous the abyss, the more compelled I am to descend into it. To excavate every single putrid, corrupt secret rotting at the bottom." I rose from my chair and walked over to him, stopping mere inches away. I could see the tiny beads of sweat bursting across his forehead. "Go back to Jonathan Ward," I whispered, my voice an icy promise. "Tell him that the blood debt from 15 years ago will be extracted, dollar by dollar, life for life. The chessboard has been set, and I have already executed my opening move. Tell him to keep his neck immaculate and wait for the blade." Jared's pupils dilated with a sudden, pure horror. He finally realized the terrifying macro-reality. My target had never been him, nor Marcus Miller. My crosshairs were locked onto the massive institutional titan who had ruled Apex International from the shadows for 15 years. He was merely a pawn being cleared from the board. "Get out," I commanded softly. Jared didn't need to be told twice. He practically scrambled over his own feet, running out of the boardroom alongside his bodyguards as if the devil himself were chasing them. The moment the doors slammed shut behind them, the boardroom erupted into a volcanic roar of hushed, panicked murmurs. "Holy shit, she just openly threatened Executive VP Ward. Who the hell is this woman? This isn't a standard corporate dispute anymore. The entire corporate hierarchy is about to be completely incinerated." I raised a single hand, and the room silenced instantly. "Our briefing will resume," I commanded, my eyes locking onto the staff. "Effective immediately, Project Starlight is under my direct, exclusive management. Every single operational lead will report straight to my desk." Furthermore, I paused, letting the silence build. "I am officially establishing an elite internal division within this department, the Truth Task Force. Their solitary operational mandate will be the deep forensic excavation into the commercial espionage conspiracy that targeted our original co-founder, Charles Vance, 15 years ago. This division is entirely voluntary. Let me establish the parameters clearly. Joining this task force means placing yourself in direct opposition to Executive VP Ward. You will face immense corporate pressure, severe hazards to your career, and active retaliation. However, I guarantee you this: every single individual who stands alongside me will see their risk rewarded 100-fold in career advancement and institutional power. My declaration was a massive stone thrown into a still pond. The room fell into an agonizing silence. It was a destiny-defining choice for every person in the room. To remain a safe, quiet cog in a corrupt machine, or to gamble their entire corporate life to follow a terrifying, brilliant leader into a war for the throne. Right then, Wayne, the senior veteran who had asked the first question, slowly, firmly stood up from his chair. His older face was a complex matrix of deep emotion, his eyes visibly bloodshot. "Manager Vance, sign me up." He stared at me, his voice cracking with a decade of buried grief. 15 years ago, I was a rookie translator. It was Charles Vance who personally reviewed my file, gave me my chance, and protected my career. He was an honorable, brilliant leader who truly cared for this company. I never believed for a single second that he leaked corporate secrets. But back then, I was a coward. I stayed silent to protect my mortgage. Today, you have given me a chance to wash the dirt off my hands. My career, my old bones, they belong to your command. Wayne's defiance acted as a catalyst. One by one, more figures began to stand up across the room. They were the older veterans who had survived the golden era of my father's leadership, or the sharp, ambitious rookies who recognized that my arrival represented a massive shift in power. Watching them rise, a subtle warmth bloomed within my chest. My father had not been entirely forgotten. The embers of his legacy were still alive, waiting for a spark to ignite a wildfire. I nodded firmly. Excellent. As of this hour, the Truth Task Force is officially operational. Our primary target is Jared Ward. I want the task force to excavate every single financial audit, every project allocation, and every corporate footprint he has generated over the past 15 years. Strip away his armor. We will use him as our opening wedge to rip apart Jonathan Ward's entire shadow network. 10. The Truth Task Force was fully operational by that exact afternoon, executing tasks at a terrifying velocity. Wayne and the senior veterans might not have possessed the hyperspeed translation capabilities of the younger staff, but their 15-year tenure inside Apex International meant they operated as a living corporate map. They comprehended every political alliance, every hidden accounting loop, and every shadow workflow inside the firm. They were the ultimate tracking hounds. And I provided them with the ultimate technological weaponry. I unlocked a specialized subtier of my proprietary Babel system for their terminals. The system wasn't merely a translation interface, it functioned as a world-class predictive data analysis engine, capable of executing massive correlation scans across mountains of corporate records to isolate anomalous footprints. Inside my newly secured division office, a massive multi-screen array displayed a highly complex, real-time relational network diagram. The central node, highlighted in pulsing amber, was Jared Ward. From his name, thousands of digital vectors bled outward, mapping his financial connections, project involvements, and shell company transfers. "Manager Vance, we have an anomaly," Wayne called out excitedly, pointing his finger at a specific branch on the monitor. 3 years ago, Jared Ward operated as the executive sponsor for a massive infrastructure asset acquisition project in Southeast Asia. The venture was coded as an S-tier initiative, sucking in an immense amount of corporate capital and capital reserves. Yet, within 12 months, the project was logged as an absolute failure, writing off a staggering $100 million loss. Another task force member, a sharp analyst named Liam, rapidly pulled up the corresponding file. I remember the internal compliance memo for that project. The company executive summary claimed the loss was triggered by a sudden, unforeseeable foreign policy shift by the host government, classified as an act of God. Jared Ward faced absolutely zero corporate discipline. In fact, Executive VP Ward personally issued him a high-level corporate commendation at the annual gala for his valiant market exploration. I stared at the pulsing project codename displaying on the central array, Project Orchid. My eyes narrowed into slits. An act of God? In the modern corporate landscape, true acts of God are incredibly rare. 99% of the time, an act of God is just a premium curtain used to obscure a massive human crime. My fingers dropped onto the workstation, executing an aggressive command override. Babel Framework. Initiate deep forensic financial correlation scan. Target. Project Orchid. Primary nodes. Jared Ward, capital distribution vectors, offshore accounts. The monitors instantly erupted into a blinding cascade of data matrices, algorithms executing at millions of cycles per second. 5 seconds later, a global financial map flashed onto the main array. A specific geographical coordinates node, centered on a notorious tax haven island in the Caribbean, bloomed into a deep, blood-red circle. Simultaneously, a highly complex, obscured capital flight pathway was mapped out in absolute clarity. From the primary Project Orchid funding pool, over $30 million had been systematically carved out, routed through a complex network of a dozen Layer 3 shell companies, and ultimately deposited into an anonymous private trust fund registered on that specific island. The trust fund's legal ownership was protected by layers of advanced corporate concealment laws, but under Babel's deep penetration data analysis, the ultimate beneficiary entity was laid bare. It belonged directly to Jared Ward's wife, Vanessa Ward. Boom! Wayne slammed his fist against the desk, his face flushed with pure adrenaline. I knew it. A $100 million corporate loss, and $30 million of it conveniently slides directly into their family vault. Manager Vance, we have enough to destroy him. Let's march this dossier straight to Internal Affairs and CEO Ross right now. Let's see how Jonathan Ward defends his golden boy after this. I slowly shook my head. Do not move too early. This evidence, while substantial, is not a fatal blow to the architect. $30 million of corporate embezzlement is a massive crime for Jared, but to an institutional giant like Jonathan Ward, it's just a localized fire. He can easily cut Jared loose, present him as a rogue actor, and execute a tactical retreat to save himself. I am not interested in clipping his fingernails. I am here to take his head. I pointed to the expansive network diagram radiating outward from Project Orchid. Jared Ward was merely a single nexus. I intended to leverage this specific financial thread to drag the remaining monsters hiding beneath the surface out into the light. Wayne, take your team and audit every single financial controller, legal counsel, and project manager who signed off on Project Orchid. Liam, execute a deep transaction scan across this anonymous trust fund's history. Isolate every single outbound wire transfer. I want to know exactly who else received a financial cut from that $100 million corporate hemorrhage. Understood, Manager. The task force members executed their commands instantly, sprinting back to their terminals. The eyes of every single employee were burning with a fire that had been absent from this division for 15 years. This was no longer a mundane corporate job. This was a high-stakes crusade for justice. And they were riding alongside a grandmaster. Over the next 72 hours, the entire localization and translation department operated at a supernatural level of output. On one hand, powered by the Babel engine's optimization, the Project Starlight translation pipeline was moving at an unprecedented velocity and precision. The 10-nation alliance received flawless, culturally pristine updates on a daily basis, advancing the negotiation timeline ahead of schedule. CEO Ross was ecstatic, greenlighting every request for resources I submitted, and even having his personal executive chef send premium catering directly to our floor. On the other hand, the Truth Task Force's shadow operations were advancing with terrifying accuracy. As more data was excavated, the dark underbelly of Project Orchid began to peel back like an onion, layer by layer. Our audits revealed that Jared Ward wasn't the only executive feeding on the carcass of that failed project. The chief financial officer's nephew, the head of the corporate legal division, and even Jonathan Ward's personal stepson had all received massive wire transfers from the Caribbean node. It was a massive, interconnected network of institutional asset stripping, deeply entrenched and thoroughly corrupt. Jared Ward was merely the operational gatekeeper who unlocked the vault for the cabal. By the time I compiled the final, ironclad forensic dossier and placed it on my minimalist desk, it was late Friday afternoon. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city skyline was bathed in a deep, blood-crimson sunset. I picked up my smartphone and tapped the internal line to the CEO. "Mr. Ross, the bait has been fully consumed. Tonight, we pull the net." 11. Friday evening, 7 p.m. The grand ballroom on the penthouse floor of the Apex International headquarters was an ocean of brilliant crystal chandeliers and luxury attire. To celebrate the unprecedentedly rapid breakthrough in the Project Starlight Treaty negotiations, CEO Ross had thrown a massive corporate celebration gala. The entire 10-nation delegation, the full executive board, and every high-performing employee involved in the project were in attendance. I arrived wearing a perfectly tailored, backless midnight black evening gown, my hair swept up into an elegant twist that accentuated the long, graceful line of my neck. I wore absolutely zero jewelry, save for a single item pinned above my heart, a pristine vintage diamond brooch. It was the final personal artifact left to me by my father. The moment I crossed the threshold into the grand ballroom, the entire room fell into a hushed cadence of whispers as every eye locked onto me. "Look, it's her. The linguistic prodigy. Jesus, she looks absolutely stunning tonight, like a queen taking her throne." I heard the CEO just granted her total autonomy over her division. "She's completely untouchable right now." Countless gazes, filled with intense curiosity, naked envy, and profound reverence, tracked my path through the room. The delegates from the 10-Nation Alliance immediately broke away from their corporate huddles, enthusiastically surrounding me to offer toasts in their respective languages. I matched their energy with effortless elegance, flowing between distinct cultural dialogue structures seamlessly, discussing their home country's art, history, and macroeconomics. I was the most radiant star in a room full of billionaires and institutional titans. And all of this was being watched intensely from the shadows of the mezzanine by two individuals: Jared Ward and his ultimate protector, Executive Vice President Jonathan Ward. Jonathan Ward was a man in his late 50s, projecting an aura of absolute refinement, a gentle, paternal smile permanently etched onto his face. He was the monster who had masqueraded as my father's brother before delivering the fatal stab. Currently, he was slowly swirling a glass of vintage Bordeaux, watching my movements with calculating, deeply amused eyes. "Jonathan, that girl is a remarkable anomaly," a senior board member standing beside him whispered softly. Jonathan let out a low, smooth laugh, taking an elegant sip of his wine. "A magnificent piece of raw talent," he murmured. "Regrettably, she is far too sharp. And in my experience, hypersharp blades have a nasty habit of lacerating the hand that wields them." A flash of pure, reptilian coldness manifested deep within his eyes. Behind him, Jared Ward's face was incredibly tense. For the past 72 hours, he had been living on a diet of pure anxiety. His instincts screamed that my task force was digging dangerously close to his ultimate ruin. He had repeatedly begged his uncle to execute a preemptive strike, but Jonathan had merely commanded him to remain calm. "Uncle Jonathan, she is getting out of hand. We cannot let her continue her audit," Jared hissed under his breath. Jonathan set his wine glass onto a passing silver tray and gently patted his nephew's shoulder. "Jared, do not lose your nerve over a child. What can a young girl possibly accomplish against us? Every single piece of data regarding our past ventures was scrubbed clean a decade ago. She is chasing ghosts." Tonight, Donald Ross threw this little gala to show off his new favorite asset to the board, attempting to leverage her momentum to push me out. "We will simply utilize this exact stage to execute her public execution." Let us remind the board who truly owns the foundation of Apex International. The corners of Jonathan's mouth curved into a sinister, predatory smile. He had already laid his trap. The gala reached its midpoint. CEO Ross took the central stage, inviting me up under the spotlight to deliver an address as the undisputed MVP of Project Starlight. I offered the room a poised smile and stepped up to the podium. The ballroom erupted into a thunderous wave of applause. I accepted the microphone, my eyes slowly scanning the sea of elite faces. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Securing the architecture for Project Starlight is an honor for my division and a testament to the future of Apex International. My opening remarks were perfectly structured, humble, corporate, and entirely graceful. Just as I prepared to transition into the core of my speech, a loud, highly disruptive voice cut through the acoustics of the ballroom from the VIP section. Manager Vance is indeed a brilliant young prodigy, a true credit to our firm. The speaker was Jonathan Ward. He stood up from his leather booth, a warm, benevolent smile on his face as he walked toward the center of the ballroom floor, looking exactly like a proud executive praising a junior colleague. Every gaze in the ballroom locked onto him. I understand that Manager Vance is not only a master of 10 languages, but has recently taken a profound interest in internal corporate compliance and asset auditing. Jonathan's voice was smooth, but his tone shifted sharply, a dangerous edge bleeding in. Which makes me wonder, Manager Vance, how well do you actually comprehend the operational integrity of your own inner circle? I let out a cold laugh deep within my mind. The fox has finally stepped out of his den. Executive VP Ward, whatever do you mean by that query? I asked from the stage, my face displaying a look of innocent confusion. Jonathan smiled victoriously. Nothing substantial. It's simply that my office just received a highly disturbing compliance whistleblower report 5 minutes ago. He pulled a premium tablet from his jacket, tapping a command that overrode the ballroom's massive central media screens. An automated video instantly began to stream across the screens. The footage was captured inside a dimly lit, high-end downtown bar. A man was shown discreetly passing a thick, stamped corporate dossier across a booth to an unidentified executive from a rival conglomerate. The individual leaking the corporate data was unmistakably the core veteran of my Truth Task Force, Wayne. The video concluded with a crystal-clear, high-definition zoom shot of Wayne accepting a thick manila envelope packed with stacks of $100 bills. The grand ballroom erupted into a volcanic roar of shock. Is that corporate espionage? Jesus Christ, isn't that old man her primary lieutenant in the new task force? She's running a nest of corporate spies. Jonathan looked up at me on the stage, his expression a masterpiece of triumphant corporate execution. Manager Vance, the individual in this footage is your hand-picked senior operative, correct? According to the metadata, he was caught red-handed selling the core intellectual property data of Project Starlight to our primary market competitor. And he operates within your exclusive Truth Task Force. As the division head, what exactly is your explanation for this catastrophic breach of national security? His voice boomed through the speakers, carrying an absolute, crushing weight. Every single word was engineered to execute me professionally in front of the entire board of directors. The collective gaze of the room shifted back to me. This time, the reverence and admiration were entirely gone, replaced by deep suspicion, corporate panic, and intense, malicious amusement from the old guard. CEO Ross's expression turned utterly pale. He hadn't anticipated Jonathan delivering a nuclear strike at his celebration gala. Behind his uncle, Jared Ward's face was a mask of unadulterated, manic joy. They believed they had severed my spine. They believed they had cornered me into an inescapable checkmate that would leave me ruined and facing federal charges. I stood beneath the blazing spotlight, staring at the carefully edited espionage footage playing on the screens. Then I looked down at Jonathan Ward's smug, hypocritical face. And I laughed. My laughter was clear, bright, and echoed beautifully through the microphone. An explanation? Executive VP Ward, you seem to have completely miscalculated the reality of this situation. There is absolutely zero requirement for an explanation. Because every single action in that video, was executed under my direct corporate authorization. My response was a thunderous bomb that detonated inside the grand ballroom. The entire elite crowd was left completely dumbfounded. The victorious smile on Jonathan Ward's face froze instantly, his eyes widening. "You? What the hell did you just say?" I said. I raised the microphone, my voice echoing with an absolute, dominant power across the ballroom. Wayne was operating as an undercover asset under my direct command. The intellectual property data he leaked was entirely fabricated by my own hand, a beautifully structured matrix of false parameters. The market competitor he met with is a private corporate intelligence operative retained on my personal budget. And that briefcase of cash? I paused, a look of pure, cutting mockery flashing across my face. That is the operational budget for my task force, being cycled through a verification loop. I engineered this entire theater for a solitary purpose: to see exactly which high-level executive inside this company was actively utilizing illegal surveillance networks to intercept my division's operations. And look at that, the true prehistoric monster has voluntarily walked straight into the light. I cut the microphone feed, my ice-cold gaze piercing straight into the pale, trembling face of Jonathan Ward. "Executive VP Ward, do you find my explanation satisfactory? Or perhaps I should address you by your true operational title. The ultimate mastermind behind the $100 million asset stripping scheme of Project Orchid?" I raised my left hand, tapping a command on my synced smartphone. The massive central screens instantly killed the espionage video. In its place, a massive, highly detailed forensic financial audit folder was displayed. The complete, unredacted corporate investigation dossier of the Caribbean Trust Fund. On the final, conclusive page of the audit, the ultimate beneficiary line, right next to Jared Ward's wife, featured another name highlighted in a blazing, blood-red marker: Harrison Ward, Jonathan Ward's only son. Boom! The grand ballroom completely exploded into chaos. 12. In that exact fraction of a second, the entire penthouse ballroom fell into an absolute, vacuum-like silence. Every voice, every breath, and every train of thought in the room was completely paralyzed. There was only the massive digital display glowing on the central screens, showcasing the undeniable, terrifying reality of the forensic audit and that blood-red name pulsing under the lights: Harrison Ward, the only son and heir of Executive VP Jonathan Ward, a man renowned across the high society circuits as a degenerate gambler who spent his life floating between the elite underground casinos of Macau and Las Vegas. Seeing his name hard-coded into the Project Orchid asset stripping network meant only one thing: a systematic, multi-million-dollar corporate theft engineered from the very top of the hierarchy. The remaining color drained from Jonathan Ward's face within a second. Those calculating, brilliant eyes that had spent decades outmaneuvering every titan in the business world were now, for the very first time, wide with unadulterated, suffocating panic. He looked exactly like an old, predatory wolf that had suddenly realized it was trapped in a steel cage, staring at the hunter. His eyes burned with a terrifying, venomous rage as he glared up at me. You. His lips trembled violently, but his vocal cords failed to produce a single coherent word. It was mathematically impossible for his mind to process this reality. The trap he had meticulously laid, the brilliant counter-strategy he believed would eliminate me, had been seamlessly converted into the exact execution block that would take his own head. He believed he was playing high-level corporate chess, entirely unaware that I had already solved the entire board before he even sat down. I had identified the corporate mole inside my Truth Task Force on day one. The Babel architecture monitored every single line of data transmission and communication within the Apex network. Any encrypted, anomalous ping to an unauthorized external node was automatically flagged. I had tracked a junior analyst in my unit transmitting daily logs directly to Jared Ward's executive secretary. I didn't fire him. I leveraged him. I intentionally utilized the mole to feed Jared a carefully constructed piece of strategic bait, the false narrative that Wayne was disloyal and preparing to sell Project Starlight secrets. I knew with absolute certainty that Jonathan Ward's intensely paranoid, ruthless nature would compel him to seize that fabricated evidence to execute a public termination against me at tonight's gala. And I simply stood on the stage, waiting for him to strike. Waiting for him to lay down his absolute trump card with an arrogant smile. Only to reveal to him, "The card you just played was a piece of garbage I slipped into your hand." And my hand was holding the actual execution order that would throw you into a federal penitentiary for the rest of your natural life. Executive VP Ward, I spoke into the microphone once more, my voice amplified with an absolute, dominant resonance that shattered the silence of the room. Regarding this forensic financial dossier, what exactly is your explanation to the board of directors? I returned his exact words to him, unvarnished and lethal. It was the ultimate, resounding execution strike delivered in front of his entire empire. Jonathan's knees buckled slightly, his massive frame swaying as he struggled to maintain his balance. Behind him, Jared Ward looked entirely dead, his legs giving out completely as he collapsed into a heap on the marble floor. It was over. Every titan in the room knew their empire was dead. CEO Donald Ross was the first to snap out of the shock. The astonishment on his face rapidly converted into a look of absolute, ecstatic triumph. He recognized that this was a once-in-a-century opportunity, a moment to completely excise the corrupt cancer that had drained Apex International for 15 years. "Security!" Ross roared, his voice booming through the acoustics of the ballroom. "Apprehend Jonathan Ward and Jared Ward immediately. Execute a full administrative lockdown on the corporate servers. Freeze every financial account tied to strategic development. Summon the Internal Affairs Director and the General Counsel. We are launching an emergency executive panel tonight, and we will audit this to the absolute bedrock." Not a single accomplice escapes this room. Ross's executive orders were delivered with rapid, crushing authority. The heavy ballroom doors were thrown open, and a squad of heavily armed corporate tactical security personnel stormed the floor. They moved with militaristic precision, pinning the frozen Jonathan Ward and dragging the weeping, limp Jared Ward up from the floor. Jonathan finally recovered a shred of his consciousness as the steel cuffs snapped around his wrists. He didn't fight the security guards. Instead, he lifted his head, his bloodshot eyes burning with an unholy, demonic hatred as he locked his gaze onto me. "Vivian Vance," he hissed, his voice sounding like dry sandpaper scraping across stone. "I severely underestimated your pedigree. I never would have believed that Charles Vance, that spineless, honorable fool, could have sired an absolute monster like you." He erupted into raw, unhinged verbal abuse. My facial expression didn't alter by a millimeter. I merely looked down at him from the elevated stage, at the man my father had loved like a brother, the man who had systematically orchestrated his destruction for a percentage of corporate equity. Jonathan Ward. My father was not a coward. He was simply a visionary who possessed too much faith in the inherent decency of humanity. And you spent 15 years demonstrating exactly how bottomless and putrid human evil can be when left unchecked. But it's of no consequence. The legacy he left unfinished, I will execute. The financial and blood debts you owe his name, I will extract. Tonight was merely the opening movement. I stepped down from the stage, walking over until I stood directly before his pinned form. I leaned in, dropping my voice to a whisper that only his ears could register. Regarding the absolute truth behind the espionage framing that took my father's life. I will ensure you articulate every single detail of that crime, from the absolute darkness of a federal cell. Jonathan's pupils dilated to their absolute limit. He opened his mouth to scream a retort, but the security guards aggressively muffled his face and dragged him out of the grand ballroom. The high-stakes celebration gala concluded in a manner no elite titan in the city could have ever anticipated. The ballroom was a sea of shell-shocked VPs and terrified board members. They stared up at me as I stood under the central chandelier, their eyes filled with nothing but pure, unadulterated dread. If my performance in the penthouse boardroom yesterday was a display of brilliant talent, tonight was my coronation as an absolute god of corporate execution. I had leveraged a brilliant, high-level psychological trap to completely annihilate the number two power of a global conglomerate in front of his entire court. From this hour forward, within the empire of Apex International, no human being would ever dare to cross Vivian Vance. CEO Ross walked over to my side, his hands visibly shaking as he patted my shoulder with intense excitement. Vivian, you are an absolute force of nature, a true goddess of strategy. I offered him a subtle, elegant smile. Mr. Ross, it is far too early to celebrate. Jonathan Ward has been cleared from the board, but the corrupt shadow network he anchored inside this firm hasn't been completely dismantled. And more importantly, I turned my head, my eyes gazing through the massive glass windows into the deep, infinite night sky. The case regarding my father's death has not achieved absolute closure. The true, high-stakes war has only just begun. 13. The day following the public downfall of Jonathan and Jared Ward. An institutional earthquake of magnitude 8 rippled through every floor of the Apex International headquarters. Every single manager and executive who had aligned themselves with the Ward faction was transformed into a terrified, panicked target. Some scrambled to shred digital trails, others desperately drafted letters of denunciation to cut ties, while the rest attempted to secure meetings with the CEO to pledge their new loyalty. CEO Ross deployed an absolute iron fist, establishing a high-level, special internal review committee under his personal command to initiate a top-to-bottom purge of the firm's administrative organs. Meanwhile, I, the architect of the entire storm, remained completely serene. I politely declined Ross's invitation to sit on the review committee. Instead, I locked myself inside my newly renovated corner office, returning my full focus to my primary mandate, high-tier translation and localization strategy. The final phase of the Project Starlight Treaty negotiations had advanced into the critical mapping of microlegal parameters. I led my core task force through grueling, consecutive night shifts. Leveraging the Babel architecture, we managed a volume of legal records and live international video conferences at a velocity that defied traditional industry standards. We ceased to operate as mere language translators. We operated as the supreme strategic buffer and execution core of the negotiation. Our system mapped out the microvariances in dialect, historical cultural psychology, and negotiating patterns of every single foreign representative, generating optimized communication frameworks before a conflict could even manifest. A single perfectly localized idiom delivered at the right second could dissolve a multi-million-dollar standoff. A brilliant historical cultural reference could instantly secure the profound respect of a foreign delegation. Under my command, the localization division, for the first time in the history of the firm, shifted from a passive operational cost center into the absolute strategic engine driving the corporation's international expansion. My task force members were undergoing a rapid evolution under the intense operational pressure. They had completely outgrown the mindset of standard corporate workers. Their eyes burned with a fanatical, profound worship whenever they looked at me. They comprehended that by standing at my side, they were actively executing a paradigm shift in the corporate world. This afternoon, I was anchoring an intensely critical technical patent licensing conference with the German delegation via secure video link. The German representative was a highly distinguished, legendary professor of intellectual property law, an incredibly rigid, austere, and unyielding intellectual. He subjected every single subclause we presented to a microscopic analysis, ruthlessly attacking any phrasing that lacked absolute structural perfection. The Apex legal team had already been thoroughly dismantled by his rhetoric, sweating profusely and retreating on multiple parameters. It was my turn to speak. I didn't launch into a defensive corporate argument. Instead, I opened by citing a profound philosophical quote by Immanuel Kant in pristine, high literary German, expressing my supreme reverence for the uncompromising rigor of the German intellectual tradition. Then, I mapped out the evolutionary trajectory of German intellectual property law, tracing its lineage from the original Reichspatentgesetz of 1877 all the way to the modern European Unified Patent Court agreements. I didn't discuss petty commercial terms. I discussed the deep philosophical framework behind the jurisprudence, the core logic governing the evolutionary metrics of international law. I utilized his native tongue within his absolute domain of expertise to demonstrate a structural comprehension that surpassed his own. On the high-definition monitor across the Atlantic, the legendary professor's expression shifted, moving from clinical arrogance to profound shock and finally to a deep, unvarnished reverence. The moment the session concluded, the austere academic stood up from his leather chair and delivered a profound, solemn bow directly to his camera. "Madam, your staggering erudition leaves me profoundly humbled. To execute an alliance alongside an intellect of your caliber is the highest privilege of my career." Inside our boardroom, the remaining Apex corporate attorneys and technical VPs erupted into a thunderous, frantic wave of applause. They stared at me as if they were looking at a supernatural entity, an omniscient, invincible force of nature. I offered them a poised smile and terminated the link. As I turned around, I found Linda standing at the threshold of the room, her expression a complex matrix of deep reverence and executive urgency. "Manager Vance, CEO Ross requires your presence in his suite immediately. The Special Review Committee has just extracted a massive breakthrough from the interrogation." I followed Linda up to the executive floor, entering Ross's private office. The CEO was flanked by the core directors of the Internal Affairs panel, the atmosphere inside the room exceptionally heavy. "Vivian, thank you for coming. Please sit." Ross's expression was incredibly grim. He slid a heavily encrypted document folder across his desk. "Jonathan Ward has completely broken under the forensic financial pressure." He signed a full confession. "Every single financial loop regarding Project Orchid has been verified. The scale of the embezzlement is astronomical, touching multiple institutional layers we didn't even anticipate." However, Ross paused, his voice dropping into a hollow cadence. "Regarding the parameters surrounding your father's espionage framing 15 years ago," he refuses to utter a single syllable. I flipped through the interrogation transcripts calmly, my eyes entirely serene. "Naturally. To confess to a systematic commercial framing that resulted in a targeted suicide would elevate his charges from white-collar asset stripping to a severe felony conspiracy. The legal nature of his reality would be permanently altered. He is attempting to anchor his liability strictly to financial corruption. A decade in a white-collar federal facility is survival. It leaves a window for him to walk out eventually. But if he admits to the conspiracy that destroyed Charles Vance, he faces absolute institutional execution and a life sentence without the possibility of parole. He will never see the sun again." Ross let out a long, exhausted sigh. "Our legal counsel aligns with your analysis. The man has transformed into a stone wall. He is entirely willing to take the embezzlement rap to lock down his silence. We have leveraged every single aggressive compliance and interrogation method permitted by law, but his psychological defense is completely impenetrable. Furthermore, his elite external legal defense team is already filing emergency injunctions against us, accusing the firm of unlawful detention and corporate overreach. Vivian, I understand this is an agonizing reality, but we have reached a dead end. We lack the leverage to force his mouth open." The surrounding internal affairs directors nodded grimly, faces full of administrative defeat. They were dealing with an old corporate shark, a monster who fully comprehended every loophole in the legal system. I closed the folder smoothly and lifted my gaze to meet Ross's eyes. "Mr. Ross, if the parameters permitted by standard law fail to yield execution, then we simply deploy an unconventional matrix of leverage." Ross froze, his eyes widening. "What exactly are you implying? What is the solitary entity Jonathan Ward values above his own survival?" I asked calmly. "His son, Harrison Ward," Ross replied without a second thought. "Every single crime he executed, every dollar he stripped from this firm, was engineered to anchor a safe, luxurious future for that degenerate boy abroad." "Precisely," I nodded, my voice dropping into an icy cadence. "Therefore, we simply strike the exact note of his affection." I pulled out my smartphone, unlocked a heavily encrypted media file, and placed the screen flat on his desk. This footage was captured less than 24 hours ago inside a private high-limit enclave in Las Vegas. On the screen, a young man was shown with completely bloodshot eyes, sweat pouring down his face as he frantically pushed massive stacks of high-value casino chips into a betting pool. It was Harrison Ward. The directional audio integration of the clip was crystal clear. It recorded the host cartel executives delivering a final, brutal ultimatum to the sobbing boy. He had just drained his offshore accounts, racking up a staggering $50 million debt to an elite underground syndicate tied to the international cartel. And the syndicate had issued a non-negotiable parameter. If the $50 million wasn't wired to their destination account within 72 hours, they would systematically harvest his limbs, piece by piece. Ross watched the video, a sharp gasp escaping his throat as he broke into a cold sweat. Is this authentic data? Flawless and verified, I replied smoothly. My operations team abroad has already established a secure line with the syndicate's enforcement heads. If we desire, we can buy out that $50 million debt portfolio within 60 seconds. Which means Harrison Ward's physical survival will belong entirely to my personal ledger. CEO Ross's gaze sharpened to an absolute point as the macro strategy clicked inside his mind. He finally comprehended the terrifying, brilliant depth of my methodology. You intend to. Symmetrical execution, my voice was colder than the Arctic shelf. Jonathan Ward built his psychological fortress on the belief that his silence protects his son's future. I will simply force him to watch, in real time, how his refusal to confess systematically drives his golden boy into a meat grinder. I will ensure that with every 60 seconds of his silence, his son's physical reality across the ocean escalates into extreme hazard. I am going to place him before a binary choice written in his own blood. Let us see if his institutional stubbornness can outlast the screams of his only child. The moment my strategy was laid bare, the executive suite fell into a horrified, breathless silence. Ross and the internal affairs directors were staring at me as if they were looking at a demon manifested in a silk suit. They had never, in their entire careers, witnessed a young woman deploy such a feral, calculated matrix of psychological warfare. This had completely broken past the boundaries of corporate competition. This was the absolute execution of a soul. Several long moments passed before Ross could form a shaky question. Executing a play like this, don't you think it breaks past human boundaries? I let out a low, beautiful laugh that carried an edge sharp enough to draw blood. Human boundaries? Mr. Ross, 15 years ago, when they systematically framed my father, stripped him of his dignity, and watched him fall from that penthouse terrace, did they consider human boundaries? When my mother collapsed from pure grief, rotting away in a hospital bed within 3 years, did they consider human boundaries? When I was left entirely alone in the world at 17, surviving in a frozen foreign country, working back-breaking shifts just to secure tuition, driving my brain to the brink of insanity to return as a weapon. My voice shook for a fraction of a millisecond before instantly locking back into an absolute, iron serenity. Did a single one of those monsters ever extend a shred of human decency to my family? To dismantle a demon, you must deploy a methodology that makes the demon scream. They're the ones who educated me in this syntax. I stood up, walking over to the expansive glass window, looking down at the crawling corporate traffic below. Mr. Ross, have your extraction team deliver this video file directly to Jonathan Ward's terminal inside the interrogation suite. And inform him. His countdown has officially commenced. 14. The high-security interrogation suite. Monolithic white walls, white furniture, blinding white fluorescent lighting that pierced the eyes with clinical intensity. Jonathan Ward sat pinned to the security chair, dressed in a plain gray inmate jumpsuit. Within 72 hours, the man had aged 2 decades. His hair was a chaotic silver nest, his face deeply hollowed, his eyes cloudy and dead. The imposing titan who had commanded the boardrooms of the city was completely gone. He sat with his head bowed, remaining entirely mute, a statue of pure defiance. No matter what administrative queries the compliance officers threw at him, his response remained anchored to a solitary phrase, "I don't know." He had anchored his entire destiny to this final line of defense, taking the white-collar embezzlement rap while maintaining absolute silence regarding the historical framing. He believed that as long as his mouth remained locked, the conspiracy that took Charles Vance would remain a ghost, and proven for eternity. He believed he could preserve his son's wealth, saving a window for his lineage to survive. He believed he could outlast the clock. Right then, the heavy secure door unbolted with a sharp electronic chime. CEO Ross and I stepped into the sterile white room. Jonathan slowly lifted his hollow face. The moment his eyes locked onto my form, the dead gray in his pupils instantly ignited into a ferocious, venomous fire. "You spiteful little parasite. You dare step into my space." He lunged forward with a sudden, feral energy, but the heavy steel cuffs and floor-anchored chains snapped taut with a violent metallic clang, pinning him back into the chair. I didn't acknowledge his rage by a single blink. I walked over to the sterile white table, pulled out the opposite chair, and sat down with absolute poise. I reached into my bag, pulled out a high-spec tablet, and placed it flat on the table directly before his face. Then I tapped the play icon. The directional speakers of the device immediately blared the chaotic, high-energy ambient music of a high-stakes Las Vegas casino floor. The next second, his son's face occupied the entire screen. That face, bloated from years of substance abuse and unchecked entitlement, was now contorted with absolute terror. Those bloodshot eyes were wide with a frantic, desperate desperation. Jonathan's breathing hitched instantly, his chest heaving against the prison uniform. What the hell have you done to my son?" I remained silent, letting the media file execute its purpose. The video feed shifted, mapping a transition into a subterranean, concrete basement environment. Harrison Ward was shown securely bound to an industrial steel chair with heavy duct tape. Standing before him were three massive, silent enforcers covered in the distinct, intricate ink patterns of the international syndicate. The lead enforcer was idly turning a specialized tactical knife in his hand, letting the sterile light catch the edge. He reached out, using the flat of the blade to lightly slap Harrison's bruised cheek. "All right, boy. $50 million. Your 72-hour grace period has officially expired. Where's our money?" Harrison was sobbing uncontrollably, his speech completely fragmented by pure terror. My father will clear the debt. He is the executive vice president of Apex International. He controls billions. Your father." The lead enforcer let out a cold, guttural laugh that carried an edge of absolute cruelty. "Our intelligence network just confirmed your old man was stripped of his title 72 hours ago for massive corporate fraud. Every single one of his domestic and offshore assets has been frozen by federal order. The man is currently sitting in a high-security lockup, facing 20 years. He doesn't have a single dollar to preserve your skin." The reality of that data hit Harrison like a physical blow, completely destroying his remaining psychological defense. He broke down into a state of pure hysteria. "No, that's a lie. My father is invincible. Let me go. I am Jonathan Ward's son. If you damage me, my father will hunt you to the ends of the earth. Shut your mouth." The enforcer delivered a brutal, backhanded strike across his face, fracturing his lip. "Your life belongs entirely to our ledger now. However, our primary director possesses an immense appreciation for your old man's stubbornness. He values a man who can hold his tongue. Therefore, he has authorized a final operational window for your father." The enforcer reached out, picking up a synchronized smartphone that was running a live, end-to-end encrypted video stream. The receiving node of that stream was this exact tablet sitting in this interrogation suite. My face manifested on the enforcer's screen via the front-facing camera. "Harrison," I spoke clearly, my voice carrying a serene resonance through the tablet speakers. "Good evening." Harrison froze, staring at the digital feed. You're that Vance girl from the office." "I am glad your memory remains intact," I said smoothly. "Your father sends his regards. He remains deeply invested in your future." "Where is my dad?" "Put my dad on the line. Your father is currently facing a compliance audit regarding his past operations. and your physical survival currently rests entirely upon his execution of a single task. I shifted my gaze on the camera, looking directly out of the tablet into the eyes of the old man sitting across from me in the real room. I am presenting your father, and you, with a binary choice. I hold a comprehensive, legally binding confession detailing the exact parameters of the commercial espionage conspiracy engineered against Charles Vance 15 years ago. The moment your father executes his signature on this document, admitting to his crimes, I will personally purchase your $50 million debt portfolio, clearing your account with the syndicate. Furthermore, I will wire a substantial capital reserve to a secure account, allowing you to establish a quiet, anonymous existence abroad under a new identity. However, my tone shifted down into a razor-sharp whisper if he refuses. Then within exactly 10 minutes, this raw video feed, alongside your complete international criminal record, including data regarding substance distribution, prostitution procurement, and money laundering, will be blasted directly to every global news agency and Interpol server. You will simultaneously become a hunted fugitive of international law and a target for the cartel's termination squad. As for your ultimate physical resolution, I paused, refusing to articulate the graphic conclusion. I merely directed the camera toward the lead enforcer, who smoothly ran the tip of his tactical knife across Harrison's neck. It left a fine, bleeding red line across his skin. Harrison erupted into a blood-curdling, frantic shriek of pure agony. "Dad! Dad! Save me! Please, Dad!" He screamed directly into the camera lens, his face contorted with a primal terror. "Sign the papers. Confess to whatever she wants. I don't want to die. I don't want them to cut my legs off. You always said I was your greatest treasure. You said everything you did was for me. Please, Dad, save my life." The video feed snapped to black, the terminal screen returning to a static administrative prompt. The sterile interrogation room fell back into an absolute, crushing silence. Jonathan Ward stared blankly at the dead screen, his entire body locked in a violent, uncontrollable tremor. Massive, heavy tears cut through the deep wrinkles of his face, dripping onto his jumpsuit. The pristine, unyielding fortress he had spent a lifetime constructing to protect his sins had been thoroughly, brutally detonated from the inside out. His calculated logic, his decades of corporate cunning, his political armor. In front of his son's raw screams, none of it carried a single gram of value. He had been driven straight to the edge of the abyss. A father's absolute breaking point. I. His jaw clicked, his throat dry as he struggled to force a sound through his lips. His psychological defense had been entirely turned to ash. I stood up, reached into my portfolio, and slid a clean, multi-page legal document alongside a premium fountain pen directly into his face. "Jonathan Ward, your countdown has exactly 9 minutes remaining." 15. The seconds ticked away on the wall clock, each strike echoing through the sterile room like a heavy hammer falling on stone. Every tick was an eternity of agony for Jonathan Ward. He sat with his head completely bowed, his silver hair falling forward to obscure his broken face. The heavy tears from his eyes fell continuously onto the white pages of the confession document, leaving dark, bleeding water stains across the clean printed text. His mind was a war zone of absolute cognitive dissonance. His raw intelligence warned him that the second his signature touched that paper, his life was officially over. He would be permanently transformed from a brilliant, untouchable titan of industry into a universally reviled monster, a traitor who had systematically murdered his own brother for a profit margin. Every shred of his legacy would be turned to toxic waste. But on the opposite side of the scale sat the raw, biological reality of his only child. The lineage he had sacrificed his soul to build, the boy who held every ounce of his human affection. Though that boy was a degenerate, a useless addict, and a complete failure, he was, at the end of the day, his son. The primal law of nature broke through his corporate calculation. 8 minutes. 7 minutes. 6 minutes. The mechanical ticking of the clock was the relentless advance of an absolute executioner. Finally, with exactly 5 minutes left on the countdown, Jonathan Ward lifted his face. Those cloudy, bloodshot eyes locked onto mine, filled with an infinity of defeat and pure, unadulterated hatred. "I'll sign," he rasped. The two syllables were dragged from the absolute bottom of his throat, sounding as if the act required every remaining joule of his life force. His hand shook violently as he forced his fingers around the fountain pen. The weight of the pen looked heavy enough to crush his bones. He stared down at the dense text, the immaculate, line-by-line documentation detailing how he had systematically conspired with foreign intelligence operatives, how he had bribed my father's personal assistants, how he had injected fabricated bank records into the boardroom terminal, ultimately driving Charles Vance to step off the penthouse terrace. Every single word was a hot iron searing his soul. The exact millisecond his signature finalized at the bottom of the compliance clause. The remaining posture in his massive frame vanished completely. He collapsed back into the security chair like a hollow suit of clothes, his spirit entirely extinguished. I reached out, smoothly picking up the finalized confession. I lightly blew across the wet ink, ensuring the signature settled perfectly into the fiber of the paper. 15 years. 15 long, agonizing years. The blood debt and framed legacy of my father, Charles Vance, had finally achieved absolute legal resolution. I looked down at the broken monster weeping in the sterile chair, yet my internal reality was entirely void of triumphant joy. There was only a deep, infinite, and echoing sorrow. "Why?" I asked softly, my voice barely above a whisper. "My father loved you like a biological brother. He handed you the co-founding equity of Apex. Why did you choose to destroy him?" Jonathan lifted his hollow eyes, letting out a sharp, hysterical laugh that was packed with pure self-mockery and ancient rot. "Why?" "Because of envy. Because from the exact hour we met in our university dorms, he was always the sun, and I was merely a shadow cast by his light. He possessed the elite lineage, the flawless Ivy League pedigree, the supernatural business acumen. Every titan adored him. Every boardroom revolved around his gravitational pull. And I, Jonathan Ward, was permanently reduced to the clever, quiet assistant, walking 3 steps behind him. Apex International was engineered by both our hands. Yet every headline, every analyst, every employee called it Charles Vance's empire. I was treated as a common manager riding his coattails. I refused to accept that reality. Why him? Why the hell did he deserve to possess everything while I starved for recognition? Therefore, the exact second that specific window manifested, I didn't hesitate for a single heartbeat. The window he referred to as an approach by our ultimate international competitor, the North Star Group. They had offered him a private financial portfolio that surpassed a lifetime of corporate salaries, alongside absolute control over their European assets, in exchange for the core blueprints of a revolutionary green energy architecture my father was finalizing, the Genesis Initiative. I systematically fabricated the encrypted email logs linking him to their servers. I spent millions bribing his chief technology officer. I placed the forged transaction trails directly onto the boardroom table before the directors. The execution was flawless. Every board member bought the lie because the data was mathematically perfect. Even Charles himself was left completely paralyzed, unable to mount a defense against his own ghost. He went to his grave entirely unaware that the brother who wept loudest at his funeral was the architect who pulled the rug. Jonathan laughed so hard tears of pure madness spilled down his cheeks. I won. I stepped over his corpse and claimed the throne of Apex. I ruled this empire for 15 years. But did I truly win? For 15 years, I have not survived a single night of peaceful sleep. Every single time I close my eyes, he manifests in my subconscious. He stands on that penthouse terrace, wearing that immaculate white linen shirt, offering me that warm, trusting smile from our university days. Then he looks at me and asks, "Jonathan, why?" Haha, why? Tell me why. The dam had completely burst. The weight of holding a terrifying, murderous secret for 15 years had completely turned his remaining sanity to ash the moment he confessed. I watched his descent into madness with detached serenity. Then I stood up. "Forward this document directly to the federal prosecutor's office," I directed Ross, who was standing behind me. Furthermore, transmit an operational update to our contacts in Las Vegas. Inform the syndicate that Apex International will not wire a single dollar to clear Harrison Ward's debt portfolio. Ross froze, his eyes wide with sudden shock. Vivian, you gave your word that if he signed, you would. I established parameters that if he signed, I would clear the account, I replied, my voice an absolute sheet of black ice. But I never stated that after the signature was secured, I would maintain that parameters. I glanced back at the screaming, unhinged old man locked to the chair. I will not clear his financial debt. In fact, have our tech task force forward Harrison's complete drug distribution and money laundering databases directly to Interpol and the Nevada State Police within 60 seconds. I want him to spend the rest of his natural life running from international warrants and cartel hit squads in a state of absolute, unadulterated terror. I want Jonathan Ward to sit inside his federal cell for the next 30 years, watching in real time as the only treasure he sacrificed his soul to protect systematically dissolves into absolute ruin. This is my final, complete gift to their lineage. Without waiting for a response, I turned on my heels and walked out of the interrogation suite. Behind me, the heavy steel door closed, but it couldn't fully muffle the sound of Jonathan Ward erupting into a primal, blood-curdling shriek of pure, unhinged madness. CEO Ross followed me into the corridor, his eyes fixed on my back with an expression of profound, terrifying dread. He finally realized the true nature of the woman he had promoted. My heart was made of pure titanium, my methodology cut cleaner and deeper than any demon they had ever encountered. I was an executive weapon of absolute destruction. I walked through the exit of the federal facility, stepping into the brilliant, blinding afternoon sunlight. I lifted my face, staring up into the deep azure sky. And for the very first time in 15 years, hot tears rolled down my cheeks silently. Dad, do you see me? Your daughter has finally brought them to justice. 16. The systemic collapse of Jonathan Ward's faction, combined with the explosive, high-stakes exposure of the 15-year-old Charles Vance conspiracy, triggered a Category 5 corporate tsunami across every tier of Apex International. The entire corporate landscape was left thoroughly shell-shocked by the relentless sequence of administrative detonations. And I, Vivian Vance, the sole architect of the purge, was overnight elevated to an almost mythical status within the industry. The goddess of retribution, the boardroom executioner, the dark queen of Apex. Countless extreme labels were slapped onto my persona by the media and internal forums. On the corporate internet, dedicated threads analyzing my strategic methodology reached thousands of pages within 48 hours. A faction of the younger staff worshipped me as a divine force of absolute justice who had single-handedly purified a corrupt conglomerate. The old guard, however, was completely petrified, viewing me as a cold, calculating viper who possessed a terrifying appetite for destruction. But regardless of their emotional alignment, a singular macro-reality was universally locked in. Vivian Vance was now the supreme, inescapable power governing the trajectory of the conglomerate. CEO Donald Ross was operating in a state of pure ecstasy. He had effectively eliminated his primary corporate rival without losing a single drop of his own political blood, while simultaneously securing a reputation for absolute managerial brilliance and ethical leadership. He immediately leveraged his momentum to present a formal motion to the board of directors, nominating me to fill the vacant seat of executive vice president, directly taking over Jonathan Ward's old throne. This motion, however, triggered an intense, bitter standoff within the inner chambers of the board. The progressive faction aligned with Ross argued that my supernatural capability and starlight execution made me the obvious choice for the future of the firm. The conservative old guard countered fiercely, claiming I was far too young, lacked traditional institutional tenure, and operated with a feral, hyper-aggressive methodology that posed a systemic hazard to corporate stability. The two sides locked horns, refusing to yield. Ultimately, the board decreed a mandatory, high-stakes special hearing. I was required to stand before the gathered multi-billionaire directors, map out my macro-strategic blueprint for the global expansion of Apex, and endure their unrestricted interrogation. This hearing was the final gauntlet. It would either cement my ascension to the absolute summit of corporate power or orchestrate my exile. The entire corporate world focused its attention on the upcoming session. Everyone comprehended that this wasn't a standard corporate interview. This was an absolute battle for the throne. The hearing was locked in for Monday morning. Ross was visibly more anxious than I was. He spent the entire weekend calling my terminal, attempting to review my speech metrics and running mock simulations of every venomous query the old guard might deploy. Vivian, you must maintain extreme situational awareness regarding the senior directors. Specifically, Director Lee. He is Jonathan Ward's direct brother-in-law, and his entire asset portfolio is tied to the old network. He is going to strike you with everything he has. And Director Stone, he is an absolute institutional fossil, incredibly sexist, and inherently despises young executives. You must maintain a posture of extreme humility and traditional corporate respect in front of him. I listened to his frantic directives over the line, a subtle, cold smile playing on my lips. Relax, Mr. Ross. Since the hour I initiated this crusade, I have never entered a battlefield where I hadn't already secured the execution order. My confidence wasn't born from cheap corporate arrogance. For the past 72 hours, I hadn't spent a single second drafting a standard corporate speech. I had ordered the full processing power of my Babel architecture to execute a solitary, deep penetration task. A comprehensive, unrestricted forensic audit into every single sitting member of the Apex Board of Directors. Their complete financial histories, their offshore holdings, their hidden family trusts, their private contract allocations, every single word they had uttered in closed sessions, and their historical voting metrics. Every shred of their data was compiled, synthesized, and analyzed through Babel's neural framework. The output was a series of highly classified, terrifyingly detailed vulnerability dossiers. When you sit down at a high-stakes poker table knowing the exact serial numbers of every card your opponents are holding, the concept of losing ceases to exist. Monday morning, 9 a.m. Dressed in an immaculate, razor-sharp white double-breasted power suit, I walked entirely alone into the grand executive boardroom, the inner sanctum where the destiny of Apex was dictated. Around the massive, custom-carved mahogany oval table sat a dozen of the most powerful institutional billionaires in the country. They sat perfectly straight in their high-back leather chairs, expressions cold, corporate, and intensely calculating, their eyes pinning me like hawks tracking prey. The ambient pressure in the room was dense enough to suffocate a lesser executive. I walked to the central podium, delivered a flawless, elegant bow to the room. Then I completely bypassed the standard, boring corporate introduction speech. I pulled out my secure flash drive, slammed it into the podium interface, and overrode the massive central projector screens. Good morning, members of the board. My name is Vivian Vance. Today, I have absolutely zero intention of wasting your valuable time with standard corporate platitudes or hollow operational slides. Instead, I would like to present a few choice data points for your consideration. I tapped the control pad, executing the first command. The screens instantly flashed the comprehensive corporate registration and tax history of an offshore entity named Orchid Global Logistics. This specific entity is registered in the Cayman Islands, completely hidden from Apex's public balance sheets, seemingly possessing zero institutional correlation to our firm. However, according to my system's forensic data penetration, the ultimate controlling equity of the shell company belongs to a private citizen named Marcus Lee. I turn my head slowly, my ice-cold gaze locking straight onto the pale face of Director Lee, who happens to be the biological brother of your wife, Director Lee. Am I correct? Lee's face transformed into an administrative shade of green, his hands stiffening against the table. What the hell is the meaning of this slander? Slander. I offered a low, dangerous laugh, tapping the trackpad once more. The screen instantly populated with a massive cascade of bank wire records and international customs clearances. Over the past 5 fiscal years, Apex International has routed over $500 million in international procurement orders exclusively through Orchid Global Logistics. And with every single transaction, this specific shell company artificially inflated the logistics invoices by a consistent margin of 10 to 15%. Where exactly did that $40 million variance migrate, Director Lee? I believe your private Swiss ledger possesses the exact mathematical answer. This is standard international supply chain optimization. It's a completely legitimate channel fee. Lee blustered, his voice cracking under the pressure. Is that your official defense? I murmured, executing the third command. The boardroom's premium audio array instantly activated, broadcasting a crystal-clear, high-definition audio recording. Through the speakers, Director Lee's voice was clearly recorded discussing parameters with his brother-in-law, explicitly detailing how to alter the logistics invoices, how to manufacture false accounting trails, and how to bypass the internal compliance auditors. The audio file terminated. The grand boardroom fell into a dead, absolute silence. Director Lee collapsed back into his leather chair like a hollow sack of flour, sweat pouring down his face. I didn't waste another second on his form. My gaze snapped across the table, locking onto the institutional fossil, Director Stone. Director Stone, my research indicates that you have been the most vocal opponent against the firm's strategic transition into green energy architectures, claiming it's an unverified, capital-intensive fantasy that threatens our core manufacturing assets. Stone let out a harsh, arrogant scoff. Damn right. We are an industrial corporation. We anchor our returns in physical steel and traditional manufacturing, not trendy climate buzzwords. An authentic champion of traditional industry. Remarkable, I nodded slowly. Then I wonder. Director Stone, what exactly is the scale of the private equity margin you hold in your son's holding firm, which happens to be the primary domestic supplier of internal combustion engine components to our automotive division? And I wonder, if Apex International executes a full transition into green energy electric architectures, what will be the exact percentage of ruin inflicted upon your family's private business interests? I didn't bother displaying a single document for a slide. I merely projected those two queries into a space with absolute, crushing serenity. Stone's face turned an intense, violent shade of crimson. His jaw worked frantically, but he failed to forge a single syllable of denial. Because he comprehended that the monster standing at the podium possessed the exact data to back the claim. I didn't stop there. Director Vance's daughter receiving offshore kickbacks from marketing vendors. Director Chen's son-in-law leveraging internal board data to execute insider trading on the stock market. I moved down the line, calling out name after name, node after node. With every name I articulated, an elite titan of industry was systematically stripped of their armor, their faces draining of color under the lights. I didn't deploy a single emotional insult or aggressive roar. I merely delivered raw, unvarnished, and undeniable data. With absolute serenity, I systematically peeled back the clean, high society suits of the lords of Apex, exposing the filthy, corrupt realities rotting underneath. The hearing had ceased to be an interview. It was a public, corporate execution. And I was the supreme grandmaster holding the blade. By the conclusion of my presentation, not a single member of the board of directors dared to make eye contact with my form. They stared down at their tablets, their bodies locked in a state of pure, paralyzed dread. They finally arrived at the terrifying realization. I hadn't stepped into this room to beg for their validation, nor to accept their interrogation. I had marched in to demand their absolute surrender. Ladies and gentlemen of the board, I said, closing the projector feed, my eyes pinning the room. I did not excavate these files to issue primitive blackmail, nor to execute a mass corporate purge today. I simply want to lock a singular macro reality into your consciousness. The old era of Apex International, the era governed by shadow financial loops, nepotism hires, and internal political warfare, is officially dead. From this hour forward, as long as Vivian Vance commands the executive operations of this conglomerate, this firm will operate strictly as a meritocratic corporate engine. The resources of Apex belong to its stakeholders, not to your private family vaults. Every single asset stripping scheme will be forensics audited to the bedrock. Every single parasite draining the life force of this corporate tree will be systematically excised. My parameters have been established. Mr. Ross, please initiate the formal board vote regarding my nomination for Executive Vice President. Those in favor, manifest your hands. The moment the final command left my lips, CEO Donald Ross was the first to thrust his hand high into the air with immense pride. The next second, a second hand rose, then a third. One by one, the multi-billionaire directors, some with trembling fingers, others with deep, choked resignation, all driven by pure survival instincts, slowly lifted their hands into the air. Finally, even the broken Director Lee and the crimson-faced Director Stone forced their hands up. Unanimous confirmation. The throne was mine. 17. The exact hour I secured my legal confirmation as Executive Vice President of Apex International, my primary action was an administrative move. I officially packed my things and checked out of the cheap, run-down downtown apartment I had rented for 3 months. I was moving back to the geographical locus of my childhood, my original home. A massive, historic independent estate located in the most exclusive residential enclave of the city. This structure had been the sanctuary of my early happiness and the absolute epicenter where my life was systematically shattered. 15 years ago, my father had fallen from the corporate tower. Immediately following his death, this entire estate, alongside his full corporate equity portfolio, was aggressively seized by the banking institutions and liquidated under the hammer. To clear a fabricated, fraudulent debt ledger manufactured by Jonathan Ward. Over the past 15 years, the mansion had passed through multiple wealthy owners. I had deployed the full data mining capabilities of the Babel engine to track the title deed and spent an astronomical premium to purchase it back from the final owner through a secure shell corporation. Standing before the massive, intricately carved iron gates once more, a volcanic wave of deep emotion crashed through my chest. The expansive front lawns had grown wild and unkempt. The grand stone fountain sat dry and choked with dust. But the ancient, majestic ginkgo tree my father and I had planted together when I was 5 still stood tall, its golden leaves rustling in the autumn wind. I walked through the grand mahogany front doors. The interior architecture remained frozen in time, exactly as mapped in my memories. Except every surface was covered in a thick, heavy layer of gray dust. I didn't retain a premium cleaning agency or corporate servants. I chose to handle the space entirely alone. I rolled up the sleeves of my silk shirt, picked up the equipment, and began a slow, deliberate restoration of the estate. I wiped down every single piece of antique furniture, polished every faded oil painting hanging on the walls. With every movement of my hands, it felt as if I were systematically wiping away 15 years of accumulated dust, sorrow, and trauma from the structure and from my own soul. Deep into the night, I finally reached the second-floor master study. This was the space where my father had spent the majority of his natural life. It had been his absolute sanctuary, a room where even I was required to knock before entering. I pushed the heavy oak door open. A deep, ancient scent of old paper and dust swept over my senses. The structural arrangement was perfectly preserved. A massive wall-to-ceiling custom bookshelf was packed with thousands of premium, leather-bound volumes spanning 10 different languages. Everything from classical economics to structural philosophy, political science to advanced physics. My father was an absolute, pure-hearted idealist. He had dedicated his life to constructing a corporate vehicle that was transparent, hyper-efficient, and deeply anchored in human progress. Regrettably, his grand vision had been thoroughly pulverized by the reptilian greed of his closest brother and the predatory nature of the global corporate landscape. I walked over to the massive executive desk. His premium fountain pen still sat in its crystal tray, alongside his favorite vintage brass globe. I extended my hand, gently spinning the brass sphere. As the continents blurred under my fingers, my touch navigated to the absolute bottom of the heavy brass axis, isolating a microscopic, unnoticeable structural indentation. This was the ultimate secret known only to my father and his little girl. I applied a precise sequence of mechanical pressure, 3 sharp clicks following a specific rhythmic cadence. Click, click, click. A subtle electronic snap echoed from the internal casing of the desk. A hidden, velvet-lined sub-drawer smoothly slid out from the side panel of the wood. Inside the dark compartment sat a solitary, sleek, military-grade black flash drive. My breathing hitched, my chest freezing. I comprehended with absolute certainty that this device held my father's final, ultimate legacy. The ultimate weapon he had preserved across 15 years of darkness. I retrieved the drive, stepped over to my workstation, and slotted it into the encrypted port. The terminal screen instantly flashed a secure, standalone administrative prompt requiring a primary password override. The character hint was a single phrase, my most priceless treasure. I didn't hesitate for a single millisecond. I typed out my name alongside my exact date of birth. VIVIN1124. The decryption sequence finalized, and the root folder opened smoothly. Inside sat a massive array of heavily coded engineering schemas, data logs, and video assets. I double-clicked the primary media file. The monitor instantly populated with the high-definition video of my father, Charles Vance. He sat right at this executive desk, looking straight into the lens, his face projecting a profound warmth and deep exhaustion. Vivian, my beautiful, brilliant girl. If your eyes are reading this data loop, it means that Daddy is no longer around to hold you in his arms. His voice carried a heavy cadence of deep sorrow and absolute fatigue. Please forgive my decision. I have reached the absolute limit of my endurance. The walls are closing in. Jonathan Ward, the man I loved like a biological brother, has systematically aligned himself with our ultimate global shadow competitor, the North Star Group, to trap me within an inescapable net. Their objective is the absolute seizure of the Genesis Initiative. That architecture is my lifetime's work, a bleeding-edge green energy matrix capable of permanently altering the global energy paradigm. I refuse to allow an innovation engineered for the progress of humanity to become a weapon of absolute monopoly for a cabal of predatory global syndicates. Therefore, I have hidden the core source code inside the most secure vault on this planet. Vivian, you are the most brilliant, exceptional child I have ever known. My faith in your intellect is absolute. I know you will decipher the path. Maintain absolute situational awareness, my girl. Never extend your trust to anyone blindly, specifically those who project the most benevolent masks. Daddy loves you for eternity. The video terminated, the screen returning to the file index. My vision was completely blurred by a volcanic eruption of hot tears. The Genesis Initiative. The North Star Group. The final pieces of the 15-year puzzle were completely locked into place. The commercial framing that took my father's life had never been a petty dispute over corporate equity inside Apex International. It was a cold, calculated, and deeply bloody global shadow war fought over a technology that could render the entire multi-trillion-dollar oil and gas infrastructure obsolete. Jonathan Ward was merely a localized pawn leveraged by the global syndicate, North Star, to execute the infiltration. His mandate was to break my father and extract Genesis. But my father chose to step off that terrace rather than surrender his soul. He chose to encrypt the data, preserving it for the future. And the remaining files inside this secure flash drive were the highly advanced, multi-tiered cryptographic breadcrumbs leading to the vault. It was an incredibly complex matrix of riddles spanning advanced linguistics, classical cryptography, ancient sociohistory, and orbital mechanics. Every single solved node merely generated a fragment of the next coordinates vector. Everything was deeply interconnected, requiring absolute structural perfection to advance. And on this entire planet, only I, the daughter who had inherited his genetic intellect, who had spent 8 years mastering 10 languages and advanced data systems, possessed the capacity to solve this maze. I aggressively wiped the tears from my face, my eyes burning with a sudden, unholy fire. Dad, rest easy. I will secure Genesis. I will execute your macro vision for this world, and I will thoroughly incinerate every single monster who stood in your way. I initiated a high-level command sequence, routing the entire processing capabilities of my Babel system to assist my brain. I plunged into the absolute core of my father's final riddle. Day and night blurred into a single stream of high-intensity cognitive processing. I locked myself inside the master study, surviving on pure adrenaline. The massive desk was covered in pages of mathematical computations, ancient linguistic roots, and stellar position charts. My brain operated at its absolute limit. Node after node was systematically cracked. Vector after vector was decoded. Finally, deep into the midnight hours of the seventh day, the final administrative lock on the flash drive clicked open. The thousands of fragmented vectors converged onto a solitary, crystal-clear geographical designation: Geneva, Switzerland. A legendary, hypersecure private banking institution. A specific deep subterranean safety deposit box registered under my late mother's maiden name. And the access protocols required two separate keys to execute. The first was a heavy, physical biometric mechanical key, which my father had concealed inside the internal gear structure of the vintage brass globe on his desk. The second key was a dynamic, time-locked electronic transmission protocol. It was hard-coded into a deep network server, programmed to automatically transmit the final alphanumeric decryption stream to a specific, secure email address on the exact hour of my father's 15-year death anniversary. And that specific destination address was an ancient, encrypted mailbox I had opened during my first year abroad, a terminal I had checked daily for a decade. I checked the terminal calendar. My father's 15-year anniversary was exactly 3 days away. The entire matrix was a beautifully orchestrated, decades-long grand strategy. A master chess match played across 15 years of time, and I was the supreme executor stepping up to deliver the final checkmate. Right then, the synchronized smartphone on my desk erupted into an aggressive, unassigned international ringtone. I paused, my eyes narrowing, before sliding the accept icon. Through the premium receiver, a low, smooth, and heavily textured masculine voice resonated with a pristine, upper-class Oxford English accent. "Am I addressing Miss Vivian Vance?" "Speak," I replied coldly. "Our principal executive extends his warmest regards and would like to formally invite you to an exclusive coffee briefing." "Identify your principal." "He navigates the market under the designation of Mr. North. He commanded me to inform you, the asset your late father owes our organization has reached its maturity date. It is time to clear the balance sheet. If you fail to present yourself at our coordinate table, he is entirely prepared to deploy our enforcement assets to collect the debt, in person." 18. The North Star Group. The shadowy international conglomerate that had haunted the periphery of my father's final words had finally stepped out of the darkness, striking like a black viper. They had tracked my progress to the exact hour. I terminated the secure call, my fingers tapping a slow, analytical rhythm against the desk. Their strategic intent was remarkably transparent. They comprehended that the 15-year anniversary of Charles Vance was the absolute tipping point, the exact hour the revolutionary source code of the Genesis Initiative would be unlocked from its vault. They were deploying a high-level intimidation play to pin me down. They were warning me that I was operating within their global web. Should I execute the flight or hold my position? Advancing straight to their coordinate table looked like a tactical suicide. North Star was an institutional leviathan that operated on a scale that made Apex International look like a regional startup, their methodology renowned for its absolute, blood-soaked ruthlessness. Step into their territory, and I might never walk out alive. But should I refuse? With their terrifying global reach, their warning that they would collect the debt in person was an absolute promise. They would bring the battlefield directly to my home turf, transforming Apex International into a war zone. The resulting collateral damage would thoroughly incinerate everything I had built. More importantly, it would place the Genesis code in extreme, immediate hazard. Therefore, the concept of a choice didn't exist. I had to go. And I had to go with maximum aggression. I intended to step straight into their inner sanctum, look this mysterious Mr. North in the eye, and map out the exact parameters of his hand. I picked up the phone, dialing CEO Ross's private line. "Mr. Ross, I am taking an immediate, indefinite leave of absence. Destination: Europe. The corporate operations of Apex are under your solitary command. Keep the board of directors pinned down. Do not allow a single internal variable to shift. Ross's voice through the receiver was wide with sudden panic. Vivian, this is madness. The board just confirmed your appointment. This is the exact hour you need to be cementing your operational authority over the divisions. I have a private account that requires absolute liquidation, I replied, my tone leaving zero room for negotiation. It is paramount. Ross fell silent for a long moment over the encrypted line. Does this venture possess any correlation to Charles's legacy? Absolute correlation. Ross let out a deep, solemn sigh. Understood. Secure your path, Vivian. I will hold the fort at Apex. Not a single rat will move while you are gone. If your operation requires any level of financial or tactical resource, wire my office. The entire infrastructure of Apex stands behind your command. A subtle warmth touched my chest. Thank you, Donald. I hung up. Then, I transmitted a highly classified, Layer 3 encrypted command to Wayne at the Truth Task Force terminal. Activate the Watchman protocol. Initiate a 24-hour systemic monitor across every stock option, data stream, and financial vector tied to the North Star Group. Before my boots touch domestic soil again, ensure Apex remains an iron fortress. The operational parameters were locked. The following morning, I boarded a private executive charter flight directly to Geneva, Switzerland. I didn't inform a single media outlet. I didn't bring a single corporate bodyguard. My solitary equipment was my custom workstation laptop, running a heavily upgraded, military-grade iteration of the Babel framework, and my personal leather backpack holding my father's vintage physical key. I comprehended with absolute clarity that this venture wasn't a standard corporate business trip. This was a lone wolf black operation. My private, solitary war. The executive charter touched down smoothly at the Geneva International Airport under a gray, overcast European sky. The moment I stepped past the private customs gate, a sleek, armored midnight black Rolls-Royce Phantom was already waiting at the curb. A silent chauffeur dressed in a pristine black suit and white driving gloves stepped forward, opening the rear door with a profound, solemn bow. The interior of the vehicle was thick with the rich, subtle aroma of an exceptionally rare Cuban cigar. Miss Vance, our principal awaits your presence at his mountain chateau on the summit of the Alps, the chauffeur murmured in flawless, unaccented Mandarin. I stepped into the leather cabin, the heavy door sealing out the world with a vacuum thud. The vehicle glided smoothly away from the terminal, advancing rapidly toward the towering, snow-capped peaks of the Swiss Alps. Outside the tinted glass, the breathtaking, postcard-perfect landscapes of Switzerland cascaded past crystal lakes, lush green valleys, ancient architecture. I didn't absorb a single frame of the scenery. My brain was running at a furious processing speed. The Babel system was executing millions of background algorithms, digging through the deepest dark web data nodes to isolate any unredacted intelligence regarding North Star Group and the identity of Mr. North. But the screen returned nothing but pristine administrative blanks. The organization's digital camouflage was flawless. They existed across the global markets like an invisible, omnipresent ghost. Mysterious, all-powerful, and terrifying. The Rolls-Royce climbed high above the clouds, navigating a private cliffside road until it finally came to a halt before a massive, breathtaking medieval stone castle fortress built directly into the living rock of a sheer precipice. The chateau was surrounded by a world of infinite, white snow and jagged peaks. The scenery was staggeringly majestic, yet it radiated an intense, bone-chilling hostility. I stepped out onto the frozen ground, where an older, elegant butler dressed in a traditional European tailcoat was already waiting at the grand stone archway. He delivered a silent bow and gestured for me to follow. We walked through massive, echoing stone galleries, moving past rare Renaissance masterpieces, ancient armor displays, and millions of dollars in classical sculpture. Finally, we reached a massive, double-height executive library featuring an immense floor-to-ceiling glass wall that overlooked a terrifying 1,000-foot drop and the infinite expanse of the snow-covered Alps. A single individual was standing before the glass, his back facing the room. He was dressed in an exquisite, white cashmere sweater, his frame tall, athletic, and radiating an effortless, supreme authority. He held a crystal glass of vintage white wine in his hand. "You arrived precisely on schedule," he opened. The voice was low, smooth, and possessed a rich, magnetic resonance. It was the exact Oxford English cadence from the telephone. He slowly, deliberately turned around to face me. The exact millisecond my eyes locked onto his facial features, my entire physical reality felt as if it had been struck by a bolt of lightning. My hands froze against my sides, my breathing completely dying. The face staring back at me was an image I held deeply within the absolute core of my childhood memories, a face that had sat across from my father in our master study for a decade, drinking scotch, playing chess, and discussing philosophy. He was the man my father had universally praised as the most brilliant, uninhibited visionary of his generation. The man I had spent my childhood addressing as Uncle Julian. Julian Ward. I whispered, my voice cracked, refusing to accept the sensory data entering my brain. But Julian Ward had officially passed away 15 years ago in a catastrophic private aircraft accident right after my father's downfall. His corporate file was a dead node. How could a dead man be standing before me on the summit of the Alps? How could he be the Supreme Lord commanding the terrifying global infrastructure of the North Star Group? The man watched my absolute shock, a warm, benevolent smile spreading across his face, a smile that was functionally identical to his biological twin brother, Jonathan Ward. No, he was not the Julian Ward of my childhood. He was the true ghost steering the machine. "Welcome to my sanctuary, my beautiful niece," he murmured, raising his crystal glass to me in an elegant toast. "Welcome to the true summit of this world." 19. I stood entirely still within the stone chambers of that alpine fortress, staring at the ghost who had supposedly died 15 years ago. My brain was navigating a level of structural whiplash it had never encountered before. Julian Ward, the twin brother of Jonathan Ward, the trusted academic brother of my father, the supreme director of the North Star Group. A multitude of seemingly disconnected identities had just collapsed into a singular, terrifying entity standing right before my eyes. The macro chessboard was infinitely deeper and more savage than I had ever projected. "You look remarkably surprised, my girl," Julian remarked, a look of profound amusement dancing in his eyes as he observed my silence. "Does it feel as though the reality you constructed has suddenly turned to glass?" He walked over to me, the subtle aroma of his expensive cigar and an overwhelming aura of supreme, absolute power closing in on my space. "Your father, Charles Vance, was an absolute anomaly. A supernatural intellect that manifests once in a century. His source architecture for the Genesis Initiative, if fully deployed, would systematically wipe the multi-trillion-dollar global energy cartels off the map overnight. Oil, natural gas, coal, all of it transformed into useless artifacts. Do you comprehend the macro-political reality of that power?" He paused, his eyes igniting with a fanatical, terrifying ambition. "It means that whoever commands Genesis doesn't just run a successful business. They command the absolute life force of global civilization. They become the solitary, undisputed sovereign of this planet. And from the first semester we shared a university lab, I recognized that he and I were the only two minds capable of visualizing that future. We were identical in intellect, but completely asymmetrical in soul. Charles possessed the mind of a god, but the bleeding heart of a saint. He harbored the delusional fantasy that a world-altering energy architecture should be gifted to humanity, open-sourced, and shared equally. Idiotic. Immature. Utterly pathetic." Julian's tone warped into pure, visceral contempt. Therefore, I engineered a grand strategy for him. A chess game that required 20 years of patient execution. I deployed my useful, greedy twin brother, Jonathan, to act as his shadow. To build an unbreakable bond of brotherhood, to anchor himself into the foundation of Apex, and to map out every single line of Charles's life. Simultaneously, I migrated abroad, established the hidden networks of the North Star Group, and began systematically eating away at his international supply lines from the dark. Finally, the exact hour Genesis reached its operational verification phase, I ordered Jonathan to execute the framing strike. My predictive models indicated Charles would break under the legal pressure and hand over the encryption keys to preserve his family. But I miscalculated his stubbornness. The man chose to jump from that terrace rather than hand his soul over to my ledger. A flash of genuine administrative regret crossed Julian's face. He died, and the digital vector to Genesis vanished along with his pulse. I spent 15 years tearing this planet apart, auditing every vault, checking every account, searching for the access path. All of it yielded nothing. Until you stepped onto the board. He leaned in, his eyes locked onto mine like a predator admiring a flawless target. You are an absolute carbon copy of Charles. The same terrifying intellect, the same relentless drive, the same magnificent mind. You single-handedly dismantled my brother Jonathan, purged his network, and claimed the executive throne of Apex. You systematically cracked every single complex riddle he left behind in his study. You have performed beautifully, Vivian. Absolute perfection. You have spent 15 years executing the exact decryption work that I lacked the capacity to solve. The terrifying reality finally crystallized in my mind. From the exact hour I landed on domestic soil and entered the cubicles of Apex International, I had been navigating within his invisible laboratory. All my strategic victories, all my brilliant purges, all my moments of sweet vengeance were merely pre-calculated steps inside his master algorithm. He had never attempted to intercept my crusade. He had explicitly nurtured it, leveraging my raw grief and my father's genetic intellect to solve the hyper-advanced cryptographic lock he was blind to. I was never the Grandmaster. I was merely the automated key he was using to unlock the vault. A volcanic wave of pure, visceral fury and a terrifying sense of helplessness threatened to hollow out my chest. So this coffee briefing is just a physical extraction play? You brought me up here to rip the drive from my hands. I asked, my voice dropping into a register of pure, frozen steel. Julian let out a rich, patronizing laugh. Incredibly primitive, my girl. I am not a common thief. I am officially extending a formal invitation for you to join me on the throne of this new era. He extended his right hand to me, his palm open. An intellect of your caliber is a resource that shouldn't be wasted running a regional firm like Apex. That is a playground for children. Align your ledger with mine. Join the global infrastructure of North Star. Let us execute the final deployment of the Genesis initiative together. The exact hour the source code goes live on our servers, the entire global civilization will bow before our command. You will secure every single dream you have ever visualized: infinite wealth, absolute institutional power, an untouchable legacy. Hell, if your heart still hungers for emotional closure, I will gladly hand you Jonathan Ward's life on a silver platter. You can execute him yourself to finalize your father's blood debt. The terms he presented were a masterpiece of absolute, demonic temptation. He possessed an absolute, arrogant faith that no human being could navigate past a contract of that scale. Especially me, a woman who had burned her entire youth just to hunt down the monsters who took her family. I looked down at his extended right hand, the hand that carried the ultimate responsibility for the blood of my father, Charles Vance. And suddenly, I let out a low, beautiful laugh. Julian Ward, do you truly believe you understand the genetic matrix of the Vance lineage? My father was indeed a pure-hearted idealist. But his idealism wasn't born from weakness. It was born from a supreme, divine strength, the desire to build and protect. And I inherited every single strand of his DNA, including his absolute parameters. Do you honestly believe I burned my life to return merely as a standard corporate avenger? I slowly shook my head, my eyes locking onto his with a sudden, absolute dominance. Vengeance was merely the operational fuel I used to clear the path. Protection has always been my ultimate parameters. To protect the macro destiny my father envisioned for this world. To protect the Genesis architecture from ever falling into the hands of a predatory monster like you. This is the solitary reason Vivian Vance stepped onto this board. I reached into my leather bag, pulled out my custom workstation laptop, and opened the sleek screen right before his face. During the 90 minutes your Rolls-Royce was carting me up this mountain for your little coffee briefing. The proprietary Babel architecture inside my workstation wasn't sitting idle. The moment my boots crossed the threshold of this fortress, Babel automatically tapped into your private satellite uplink and localized internet arrays. It has systematically penetrated your core servers, excavating 20 years of unredacted intelligence regarding North Star Group, every single instance of commercial espionage, market manipulation, geopolitical bribery, targeted assassinations, everything. I spun the screen toward his face. The monitor displayed the specialized terminal interface of the Watchman protocol I had ordered Wayne to execute. On the layout, a massive, blood-red digital countdown was ticking down with high-frequency speed. The automated transmission sequence has exactly 180 seconds remaining. The millisecond the clock hits zero, this entire forensic dossier, complete with the raw financial logs, your biometric profiles, and the high-definition audio recording of everything you just confessed to me, will be transmitted to the primary servers of the 5 largest global media cartels, the Department of Justice, and the Central Network of Interpol. Julian Ward, you spent 20 years in the shadows attempting to become the sovereign of this planet. Within exactly 3 minutes, you will become the most hunted, internationally red-noticed criminal in human history. The benevolent, paternal mask on Julian Ward's face shattered into a million pieces. His features contorted into a terrifying display of raw, unhinged fury and visceral shock. "You spiteful little bitch. You wouldn't dare." He let out a feral roar, lunging across the space to crush my throat. Behind him, the double doors flew open as his security enforcers aggressively raised their automatic weapons. I stood perfectly still before the glass abyss, my eyes fixed on his face with an absolute, divine serenity. "Go ahead. Order them to fire. But there isn't a bullet on this planet that can recall data once it enters the network. From the exact hour you allowed me to cross the threshold of your sanctuary, your 20-year grand strategy was officially terminated. Because you made a fatal flaw in your programming, Julian. You assumed you were manipulating a corporate piece, entirely unaware that you were sitting across from the Grandmaster." The digital countdown hit absolute zero. My finger dropped onto the mechanical enter key with an iron finality. 20. The exact millisecond my finger initialized that enter key, the entire global corporate and political landscape was struck by an absolute, nuclear-grade intelligence detonation. The North Star Group, the mythical, omnipresent leviathan that had steered the deep financial and technological currents of the planet from the shadows for decades, saw its entire matrix of crime systematically exposed to the light of day. The world erupted into absolute chaos. Within minutes, financial regulators, federal law enforcement networks, and international intelligence syndicates across 40 countries launched synchronized, aggressive raids against their assets. Their global credit lines were frozen, their market shares suffered an immediate, catastrophic freefall, and their hidden political protection networks were thoroughly sliced to ribbons. Julian Ward, the mastermind who had come within inches of claiming the absolute sovereignty of global civilization, found his solid stone alpine fortress surrounded by the elite tactical anti-terror units of the Swiss military. According to subsequent tactical logs, his private security force mounted a fierce, suicidal resistance. But against the crushing weight of an absolute state apparatus, the violent resistance of a corporate cartel carries zero survival capability. He was ultimately located inside the absolute deepest concrete vault of his chateau, having utilized his own tactical sidearm to execute a clean termination through his temple, ending his trajectory as a brilliant, murderous titan in a pool of his own blood. As for the specific parameters of how I, Vivian Vance, managed to navigate past his security enforcers and exit that mountain fortress entirely unharmed, no media outlet on Earth ever secured that data. The public only comprehended that while the geopolitical storm was tearing North Star to ash across the globe, the architect who pulled the trigger had already quietly landed back on domestic soil. I didn't accept a single request for a television interview. I systematically blocked every international agency attempting to present me with medals or corporate honors. I simply walked back into the localization suite of Apex International, sat down at my minimalist desk, and returned to my operational routines. As if the entire global paradigm shift had been a routine day at the office. But every single human being on this planet comprehended that the matrix had changed. Apex International, having been thoroughly insulated from the North Star fallout due to my preemptive compliance actions, saw its international corporate valuation skyrocket to the absolute summit of the markets. CEO Donald Ross successfully completed his transition into the chairman of the board of directors, while I directed the full operational machinery of the firm toward a solitary, monumental venture, the official resurrection of the Genesis Initiative. On the exact hour of my father's 15-year death anniversary. The hard-coded automation script executed flawlessly, and a solitary, heavily encrypted data stream settled into my old personal mailbox. Holding the physical biometric key retrieved from the vintage brass globe and the dynamic electronic stream, I walked alone into the deepest subterranean level of the Swiss private banking institution in Geneva. Inside the sterile, titanium-reinforced executive vault, I unlocked the deposit box registered under my mother's maiden name. There were no blocks of gold bullions, no stacks of currency, no physical luxury items. There was only a compact, high-spec military-grade silver hardware drive, alongside a single sheet of heavy parchment paper covered in my father's refined, elegant handwriting. Vivian, my beautiful, eternal love. If your fingers are holding this parchment, it means you have evolved into a magnificent, invincible individual capable of commanding your own destiny. This hardware drive holds the complete, unredacted source architecture of the Genesis Initiative. It functions as an absolute Pandora's box. Wielded correctly, it possesses the capacity to illuminate this entire planet with infinite, clean energy. Wielded with greed, it can unleash absolute economic destruction. I have preserved this legacy for your hands, not to force you to execute its deployment, but because my faith in your wisdom is absolute. I know you will isolate the exact parameters, the exact hour, and the exact methodology to ensure this innovation serves the survival of humanity. Never forget, my girl, technology itself possesses zero morality. But the human being commanding the technology carries an absolute choice. Daddy rests easy, knowing the future belongs to your decision. With infinite love. Your father, Charles Vance. I pressed the silver drive against my chest, hot tears cascading down my face like a river. I finally achieved a complete, profound comprehension of my father's macro strategy. He hadn't left me a primitive weapon of corporate revenge, nor a standard inheritance of material wealth. He had preserved for me the ultimate human privilege, the autonomy of choice, and a supreme, destiny-defining responsibility for the future of civilization. I returned to domestic headquarters. I did not incorporate the Genesis source code into the private asset sheets of Apex International, nor did I claim it as my private financial monopoly. Instead, I leveraged my executive power to anchor a multinational alliance, uniting the country's elite scientific institutions alongside several highly reputable, nonprofit international environmental coalitions to establish a sovereign entity, the Genesis Foundation. The complete source code was handed over to the Foundation's trust, open-sourced for collaborative research and development. Every single engineering breakthrough was hard-coded to be distributed to every nation on Earth under a model of absolute equity and minimal cost. I merely reserved a solitary operational parameter for myself, the absolute right of a unilateral veto, to guarantee with absolute certainty that this technology would never, across the span of human history, deviate from the altruistic parameters my father and I had established. This decision left multiple market VPs and financial analysts thoroughly bewildered. They argued that I had voluntarily surrendered an innovation that would have instantly transformed me into the wealthiest, most powerful individual sovereign on Earth. But inside my own consciousness, I comprehended that what I had secured surpassed material wealth by a century. I had achieved absolute, infinite internal peace, and a wide, boundless, and beautifully clear horizon. I maintained my office as the Executive Vice President of Apex International, the Localization and Translation Department, operating under my continuous evolution, had officially ascended into the world's most elite linguistic intelligence and global strategy core. Wayne and the dedicated members of the Truth Task Force received high-level promotions, massive equity allocations, and absolute job security. CEO Ross remained my most unyielding, loyal political ally within the boardroom. As for Harrison Ward, the degenerate son of Jonathan Ward, I had technically fulfilled the exact parameters of my word. I had completely stepped away from his ledger. According to a brief intelligence brief from Nevada, the exact hour the cartel enforcers verified that his family's offshore vaults were completely empty, he was forced into a frantic, terrified flight into the desert. During a high-speed pursuit by enforcement assets, his vehicle lost traction, plunging 1,000 feet into the absolute abyss of the Colorado River Canyon. His remains were never recovered. He and his father had ultimately paid the absolute, maximum price for their ravenous greed. The board was clean. Every single debt was fully liquidated. 21. 1 year later. The grand auditorium of the Apex International Global Headquarters was a sea of high-definition cameras and international media networks, broadcasting live to hundreds of nations. I stood under the intense white spotlights as the chief strategic officer of the conglomerate, looking out at the massive gathering of global journalists, scientists, and institutional investors. I opened my mouth, deploying 10 separate languages sequentially to map out the future of our enterprise. It was a breathtaking macro-strategic blueprint, an entire corporate ecosystem anchored upon the open-source infrastructure of the Genesis Initiative, flanked by clean, bleeding-edge automotive frameworks and high-tier artificial intelligence integrations. An authentic realization of the ideal world my father had envisioned, built by my own hands. The global launch was an absolute, historic success. The market sheets of Apex International experienced an unprecedented, vertical surge, breaking every historical stock record in the index. I stepped off the elevated stage, my synchronized smartphone buzzing continuously with thousands of congratulatory notifications from the highest tiers of global society. Among the deluge, a solitary text message from an unassigned international number materialized on the interface. The presentation was an absolute masterpiece. You have evolved into a far more formidable grandmaster than Charles ever was. I stared at the characters on the screen, my steps faltering for a fraction of a second. Then a subtle, beautiful smile spread across my lips. I didn't transmit a digital reply. I comprehended with absolute certainty exactly who the data stream belonged to. In this world, there will always exist a select few individuals, a few phantom variables, who choose to protect your reality from the shadows in their own quiet way. Like the brilliant, silent stars burning in the deepest corners of the night sky. I walked through the grand exit of the convention center, stepping into the warm, golden light of a perfect autumn sunset. A familiar luxury Bentley Continental pulled up smoothly to the curb. The driver's side door opened, and CEO Donald Ross leaned out, waving at my form with a massive, relaxed grin. Executive VP Vance. Shift's over. If we don't hit the highway right now, I am going to be severely late for my daughter's middle school PTA briefing. I laughed, stepping into the premium leather passenger cabin. Donald, you're starting to operate exactly like a professional chauffeur. To operate as the personal driver for the ultimate financial goddess of Apex is the highest privilege of my career. Ross joked, steering the vehicle smoothly into the evening traffic flow. Besides, I am technically driving to see my future boss, so I have to maintain a flawless performance index. His daughter, a brilliant, fiercely independent girl of 12, was my absolute #1 disciple. She spent her days tracking my corporate records, declaring to anyone who would listen that she was going to run the world exactly like Vivian Vance. The vehicle glided effortlessly into the golden stream of the city traffic. The premium audio array was quietly playing a classical, timeless melody. When the wind rises once more, I quietly send my gratitude into the abyss. I looked out the window as the massive skyscrapers began to ignite their infinite, brilliant neon displays, looking exactly like millions of pulsing, beautiful stars guiding the path. My smartphone chimed with a final internal update from Wayne at the task force terminal. Manager Vance, the Babel architecture just isolated a highly peculiar, anonymous text thread uploaded to an encrypted international forum. The syntax maps out a direct message. I spent 15 years navigating the darkness to secure a solitary answer. Now I am prepared to spend the remainder of my natural life waiting for a solitary person. Are you willing to execute the contract? The data metadata indicated the IP address originated from a highly exclusive, completely private medical sanatorium tucked away in the valleys of Switzerland. I stared at the lines of characters, the corners of my mouth curving into a soft, serene smile. I raised my fingers, typing out a brief, two-word response on the interface. Dossier received. I locked the smartphone, sliding it into my pocket, and lifted my gaze to stare straight ahead through the windshield. The highway before us was an infinite ribbon of beautiful, brilliant light cutting through the city. Exactly like the future waiting for my command.